Today's video is a collection of 5 fan favorite stories that all sound like they're straight out of a fiction novel, but they're not. All these stories actually happened. Now, these 5 fan favorites have all been completely re-edited for today's episode, so even if you may have heard or seen one or all of them before, this will still feel like a brand new viewing experience. And for all you longtime fans of the channel, make sure you pay extra close attention to find that secret image in one of these stories. The first person to find the secret image and comment what it is and the timestamp of where it appears in the comment section, I will pin your comment to the top of the comment section. Also, Ol Lungy is back again, so make sure you comment your favorite fact he shares in today's video. But before we get into today's 5 stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, on the like button's birthday, make sure to mail them a birthday card. But ensure you first booby trap it with fart spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's 5 stories. The Tromp family were by all accounts a normal, hard-working household. 51-year-old Mark Tromp and his wife, 53-year-old Kobe Tromp, had established a successful red currant farm and earth-moving business at their property in Sylvan, which is just outside of Melbourne. Their 3 adult children, which were 29-year-old Rihanna, 25-year-old Mitchell, and 22-year-old Ella, all lived and worked with them at the farm. But their seemingly ordinary lives would change forever on Monday, August 29th, 2016. That day, without any warning, the family dumped their passports, credit cards, and cell phones on the kitchen table and ran out the front door, leaving it unlocked. They hopped into Ella's car and drove north. 30 kilometers into their journey, and it was discovered that the son, Mitchell, still had his phone, and so the others yelled at him to throw it out the window, and so he did. He chucked his phone out the window. The family drove all day and night until they reached a motel in the New South Wales town of Bathurst, 800 kilometers away to the west of Sydney. The following morning, Mitchell decided he did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so he abandoned his family and began heading home. The remaining 4 family members did not go after Mitchell. Instead, they just piled back in the car and drove east to a popular tourist destination called the Genelin Caves. It was there that the 2 daughters, Rihanna and Ella, decided that they also did not want to be a part of whatever it was they were doing, and so they snuck away from their parents and stole a car and began heading home. The parents, after realizing their daughters had now left, did nothing. They did not go after them. The 2 sisters drove south to the town of Goulburn, where they called the police to report their parents missing. The story made its way into the media, where the family was initially ridiculed for getting lost in the first place and getting completely separated in an area they should know well. This is their country. It's not a remote area. They were near big established towns the entire time. It just didn't make sense. But when police went to the Tromp family farm back in Sylvan and they discovered the front door was unlocked, there were credit cards, passports, and phones on the table, suddenly it seemed like there was a lot more to this case than met the eye. And so as this strangeness came into focus in the media, people stopped ridiculing the family and began speculating what caused them to suddenly flee their house. Was it something in the water they were drinking? Was there chemicals on the farm that was screwing up their brain? Were they running from someone? Were they in debt? What was it that caused this strange sudden departure? Back in Goulburn, after reporting their parents missing, Rihanna and Ella inexplicably separated at a gas station. Rihanna just climbed in the back of some utility truck, and Ella hopped in the stolen vehicle and started driving home. Later that night, Ella would become the first Tromp family member to be located by police when she arrived at the farm and police were waiting for her there. Mitchell would arrive back home the following morning after taking a series of trains to get there. Once Mitchell and Ella were reunited, they made a statement to the media outside of the family farm, and as you're looking at them, it's clear they're totally shell-shocked. They don't know what's happened, and they're trying to articulate why their family left in the first place and what they were doing and where they're going, and the best they could do was to say, well, there was a lot lot of pressure on our family, and it was building up, and these things are just difficult to explain, and I don't really know what we were doing. Mitchell would say that there was a belief that people were after them. There was some paranoia there, but that paranoia was predominantly held by their parents. While Mitchell and Ella were certainly in a state of shock, they did seem mentally stable. The same could not be said for their sister, Rihanna. She was discovered by the driver of the truck she had snuck into after he had driven over an hour away. He had pulled over to check on something. He had gone around the back and then had the life scared out of him when he saw Rihanna just sitting there in a what he called catatonic state. She didn't know her name. She didn't know where she was. She was just sitting there. Rihanna was taken to the Goulburn Hospital, where she was put into their psychiatric unit. As media interest grew, the parents, Mark and Kobe, got back in their car up at the Jenolan Caves and drove south towards Melbourne. A day later, on Wednesday, the pair had driven 600 kilometers to the Victorian town of Wangaratta, where they too inexplicably separated. Kobe turned around and started heading north again by means which are still a mystery, and a day later was found 350 kilometers away in the town of Yass in a very agitated state. She was taken to a hospital there, but then transferred to the Goulburn psychiatric unit to be with her daughter, Rihanna. Mark stayed in Wangaratta, and he was there for several days, and during his time there, he was spotted by a young couple really aggressively tailgating them, and then he was spotted again on another day fleeing from the car he had been driving. Finally, on Saturday evening, all of the Tromp family members were accounted for when Mark was finally discovered sitting next to the road near the Wangaratta airport. He was questioned by police and then assessed by a mental health officer, and then was released into the custody of his brother, who was a police officer. And as they drove away, Mark turned around and flipped off the photographers that had converged on the spot. He later released a more contrite statement, apologizing for the hurt and concern that were caused by these events, and he also paid respect to the police and the volunteers that went out looking for them. After the investigation, the police determined that nobody was chasing this family. They were not in any danger. The family had also not taken any drugs. They were not in debt. They were not involved in any sort of religious cult. And prior to this strange event, the family had no history of mental health issues. After the dust had settled and the Tromp family was just back at their farm going about their normal life, every media outlet wanted an interview with them to try to learn more about why this strange thing happened. But the family said, we're not doing interviews, we're not putting out any more statements, we just want to be left alone. And so as a result, all people could do was theorize. And the leading theory was that the Tromp family was suffering from something called folie à deux, which is a French term that means madness for two. And what happens is one person who is delusional can pass that delusion on to other people. And this typically only happens in very close-knit families or in very tight romantic relationships. While it's unclear which of the Tromps became psychotic first, doctors say it is clear at some point they were in a cycle of reinforcing each other's delusions if this folie à deux theory is the right one. While the full reasons for why the Tromps went on this strange voyage will probably never be known, the police deemed it a family matter and did not press charges. Richard Russell, better known as Bebo by his friends and family, was born in 1989 in Key West, Florida, but at the age of 7, he moved to Wasilla, Alaska. He was a standout athlete at Wasilla High School, competing in football and in track and field. After graduating in 2008, he moved to Coos Bay, Oregon, where he briefly attended a community college. While he was there, he met a woman named Hannah Strassner, and in 2011, they got married. And shortly after that, they opened a bakery that they would run together for 3 years. Hannah, who had gone to culinary school, was very detail-oriented and ran the show at the bakery. Bebo, on the other hand, was not professionally trained and was much more laid back and interested in experimenting with new and wild recipes. In 2015, with heavy hearts, they decided to sell the bakery so they could move to Seattle and be closer to Hannah's family. Once they arrived there, Bebo got a job at the SeaTac airport as a ground service agent for Horizons Airline. It was not a job he necessarily wanted, but they needed the cash. After working at Horizons Air for 4 years as a ramper, someone that moves the luggage in and out of the aircraft, Bebo was given some additional responsibility. They asked him to be on a 2-person tow team. A tow team is in charge of moving airplanes around in between their flights. And so the way this works is one person goes down and drives the actual tow vehicle and hooks that up to the airplane and begins moving it around, and the other person would go up into the cockpit, turn the plane on, and then work a couple of very basic systems to help get the plane to go where it needs to go. The members of a tow team are one of the very few number of people that are allowed to go into the cockpit of an aircraft by themselves. And so Bibo really relished this opportunity, and when he was up there, he found himself fascinated with all the controls, and any chance he got, he would ask a pilot if they were inside of the aircraft to teach him what some of these controls were. But one time, Bibo was flipping some of the switches in the cockpit that he was not supposed to touch, that other pilots had told him about, and the pilot of this particular plane caught him doing it, took exception to it, and reported him. But surprisingly, there were no repercussions. It was just really embarrassing for Bibo. Like many of the other ground service agents working at Horizon Airlines, Bibo was generally unhappy with his job. He felt like it was boring, that there wasn't much upward mobility, and that he was criminally underpaid. But there was one redeeming quality of his job, and that was, in virtue of working for an airline, he got all sorts of free airfare. And so not only did he get to fly for free all over the world, he got to fly basically anytime he wanted up to Alaska to visit his hometown and see his family, something that was very important to him. The people that knew Bibo said he had a great sense of humor, he was extremely friendly, and you could always catch him with his head buried in a book. And his coworkers would say he had aspirations to be an officer in the military. And when all those people that knew Bibo the best were asked, why do you think he did what he did on August 10th, 2018, none of them have an answer. On that fateful day at 1:35 p.m. local time, a passenger airplane owned by Horizon Airlines flew into SeaTac Airport where Bibo worked. And so this plane was not scheduled to fly for the rest of the day, so it was taxied to the far north section of the airport to a parking spot called Cargo 1. At 7:15 p.m. that evening, Bibo arrived at Cargo 1 and he climbed inside the empty aircraft and made his way into the cockpit. He followed the startup procedure until the plane was on and the propellers were starting to turn. He hopped out of the plane, got in his tow vehicle, and used it to turn the plane around so its nose was pointed towards the airfield. He moved the tow vehicle out of the way and then climbed back inside the aircraft, shut it behind him, and got in the cockpit and began taxiing out towards the runway. For the next few minutes, air traffic control bombarded Bibo over the radio, asking him, "What are you doing? This is unauthorized movement. You should not be heading towards the runway right now." But Bibo never responded. Instead, he just continued on until he reached the beginning of the runway, at which point, despite having no flight experience, minus some video games and fiddling with some switches in the cockpit while he was in the tow team, he managed to go full throttle and get this plane careening down the runway and successfully took off. But that was nothing compared to what he did next. Over the course of his 1 hour-long flight, he expertly performed backflips and barrel rolls and these huge loops in the sky, dangerous maneuvers that even expert pilots might risk stalling the plane and crashing. But he didn't. It was like he'd been doing this his whole life. Onlookers on the ground were shocked to see this passenger airline performing these ridiculous stunts so low to the ground that all over Seattle, you had people filming this plane and posting it to social media. So in real time, it was like the world was made aware of Bibo up in the sky. And so people went outside and just watched as he flew around. But the real story is not the aerial stunts that Bibo was pulling in the sky. It was the strange, calm conversation that Bibo had with the air traffic controller the whole time he was up in the sky. The extremely professional, very calm air traffic controller tries to convince Bibo that he really needs to come down and land this aircraft. And he begins telling him where he can go, different airfields, and if he needs to, he can land out in the Puget Sound. But Bibo kind of laughs it off and says, "You know, I wasn't really ever trying to land this plane. I just wanted to do a couple maneuvers before I put it down." And so as Bibo soared through the sky, this controller tries in vain to convince Bibo to stop what he's doing, and Bibo's just completely ignoring him and cracking jokes with him and telling him how he just loves the scenery up there and how beautiful it is. And then at one point, Bibo becomes remorseful and he says to the controller that he really hopes he hasn't ruined his day, and he feels really bad for the people that he's inevitably going to hurt. And then in Bibo's most poignant moment, he tells the controller that he's just a broken guy and he's got a couple of screws loose and he didn't know it until now. Towards the end of the flight, Bibo tells the controller that he's going to try for one more barrel roll, and if it goes well, he's going to go nose down and call it a night. The controller tries to convince him that it's still possible to try to land, but at this point, Bibo's not listening. At 8:45 p.m., the nose of the plane was seen pointed straight down at the earth. 1 minute later, at 8:46 p.m., Bibo intentionally crashed into a small island off the coast of Seattle. He was the only fatality in the crash. Here is a condensed version of some of the commentary between Bibo and the air traffic controller, along with some of the real footage of him flying the plane.
I just kind of want to do a couple maneuvers, see what it can do before I put her down, you know?
Approach welcome, final runway 16 right.
Welcome. Man, I'm a ground service agent. I don't know what that is.
There is the runway just off your right side in about a mile. Do you see that?
Yeah, I wouldn't know how to land it. I wasn't really planning on landing it. I got a lot of people that care about me, and it's going to disappoint them to hear that I did this. I would like to apologize to each and every one of them. Just a broken guy. Got a few screws loose, I guess. Never really knew it until now. I think I'm trying to do a barrel roll. And if that goes good, now I'm just going to nose down and call it a night.
How Bebo was able to take off and fly around and pull these stunts without any formal training remains a mystery. Some people believe he was planning this for a long time, which is why whenever he was in the cockpit, when he was in the tow team, he would ask pilots to explain the different switches and toggles and how to use them, and he would feign that he was just curious, when in reality he was actually trying to learn how to fly the plane. As for the incredible stunts he was doing, it's believed he did learn those in a video game. But even if this is true, that he learned how to fly a plane by asking a couple questions and playing video games, the chances of it working out and actually successfully taking off and doing what he did are astronomically low. Normal people can't do that. And that's why the internet gave Bebo a new nickname to commemorate the fact that basically no one could have done this but him. And so they named him the Sky King. On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels, and, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping. It was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to and he feels himself. He's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open and he climbed out of his car and he looked a little ways down the road, and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side and it was hissing steam, and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck, and so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open, and this woman with blonde hair jumped out and she ran over to him and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman and he's kind of sizing her up, and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman and the old woman's looking right back, and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what? I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded, and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out and she rushed over to the truck and she climbed on top of it and she reached down and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van, and the white van sped off down the road, and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, well, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him, and so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately, loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear, and the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the US Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid and just didn't say anything and kind of just stepped back like this, like he wasn't going to answer. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved. In 1887, 35-year-old Robert Ledru was a very talented detective working in Paris, France. He was so talented that periodically he would get called upon by other police departments around the country to help them solve their most difficult cases. And so that year, there was this coastal town in northern France that had this string of sailors that went missing, and nobody had the slightest idea what had happened to them. And so naturally, Robert was called in to investigate. The night Robert arrived in this town, it was very late, and Robert Robert was tired, so he went straight to his hotel and he went to bed. The following morning, he got up and he went straight to the local police department to meet the local officers that he would be working with on this investigation. But when he got there, he was told that the missing sailors case had been lowered in priority because during the night, a murder had been committed down on their beach. And so that was now their main focus. And so they apologized to Robert and said, I'm sorry you came all this way for nothing. But since you're here, do you want to help us in this beach murder investigation? And Robert said, sure. The victim was a middle-aged man named Andre Monet, who owned a dress shop in Paris, France. He had recently moved to this coastal town to enjoy the beautiful scenery. When his body was discovered early that morning, it was quickly determined he had been killed by a single gunshot wound to the chest, where the bullet actually went clear through him out the other side, but they hadn't found the bullet. There were no suspects, there were no leads, there was no clear motive. However, they were able to rule out robbery because there was still money in Andre's pockets. And so Robert and the other local officers left the police station and made their way down to the beach, where they began examining the area where Andre had been found. The local officers focused on looking for the bullet, while Robert decided to walk a little ways down the beach to see if there was any evidence that had been overlooked in the initial search. And after only walking a very short distance, Robert noticed some barely visible footprints that appeared to pass right by where Andre's body had been found. And these footprints, they continued past that area and then up a flight of stairs up onto the road where they disappeared. Robert called over the other officers and told them to make plaster casts of these footprints so he could analyze them. What that meant is the officers would literally just pour liquid plaster inside of these prints, and then when they dried, they would pull that plaster out, and it would literally be a 3D model of the foot that had made the prints. And so as the officers are working on these casts, Robert says to one of the officers that these prints looked really odd to him, like they were familiar in some way, but he just couldn't place where he had seen them before. Less than an hour later, when the plaster had dried, the officers pulled them out and they handed them to Robert. And as soon as Robert looked at them, he physically reacted to what he was seeing. It was like he was disappointed. And then without saying anything, he just walked down the beach with these plaster casts until he got to this secluded area where he sat down. And he sat there for hours and hours, just staring at the plaster casts, seemingly unaffected by the sun that was blazing down on him the whole time and the tide that was very quickly creeping up on him. The local officers who were watching this, they didn't know anything about Robert. All they knew is his reputation, which is he is this totally legendary detective, and so they didn't dare question his methods, even though this seemed really odd what he was doing. Finally, by mid-afternoon, Robert would put the cast down, he would stand up, and he would walk back over to the mystified local officers. And when he walked up to them, he would say, "There's no reason to stay at the beach any longer or interview any more witnesses. I think I've solved the case." But then instead of elaborating, he just turned around and walked up off the beach and headed back for his hotel. The local officers just looked at each other and shrugged, and they left too. Early the next day, the bullet that had killed Andre Monet was found on the beach. And so when Robert showed up to the beach, the chief of police handed him this bullet in an effort to help him continue the investigation. And as soon as Robert looked at it, he sighed and said, "Okay, now I know for sure what happened." And then Robert proceeded to break down the murder. He said the killer woke up in the middle of the night on the night that Andre was killed, and he got out of his bed, he put on his clothes, and then he headed down to the beach. There, he encountered Andre Monet, a man he didn't know, who was most likely out for a midnight stroll as well. The two men struck up a friendly conversation, but at some point it turned into some sort of quarrel, at which point the killer drew his pistol, shot Andre in the chest, and then fled the scene. Robert told the local police chief that the reason he knew all these details is because he had been the killer. He killed Andre Monet. But he didn't do it on purpose, and he didn't remember, because he killed Andre Monet while he was sleepwalking. He told the chief when he was given those plaster casts of those footprints, he knew immediately why he thought those prints looked so familiar. Because as soon as he looked at the casts, he could tell whoever had made the prints was missing a toe, and as it happened, Robert was missing a toe. So those prints looked exactly like his footprints. And that morning, when he had woken up in his hotel room before even going down to the beach, he had noticed that his shoes and his socks, which were next to his bed, were sandy and damp. And he thought that was so strange because he couldn't remember how they got that way, but he was too busy to investigate. And that night, after he had sat all day looking at the casts and then left the beach, leaving the local police officers totally mystified, he had gone back to his room, and the first thing he did was get his revolver out from under his pillow, and he discovered that one bullet was missing, and he always kept his revolver fully loaded. And so he spent the rest of the night trying to convince himself that this was just one big coincidence. But the following morning, when he was given that bullet, he knew immediately that this was not a coincidence. The bullet that had killed Andre Monet was the same type of ammunition that he loaded his revolver with. And so he had to be the killer. He had effectively caught himself. The police were totally shocked and did not believe this at first. More specifically, they didn't want to believe that Robert, their star detective, was behind this horrible homicide. But eventually, after examining all the evidence, they agreed he had to be the killer. But to test whether this really was sleepwalking and not some elaborate cover-up by Robert, they decided to conduct an experiment. Robert, who was fully cooperative with the investigation, was told to sleep in this jail cell where he would be monitored 24/7 by armed guards, and in this cell with him would be a revolver loaded with blank rounds, and he was told to keep it under his pillow. For the first couple of days, nothing happened. Robert never touched the revolver during the day or when he was asleep. But about a week into this experiment, Robert suddenly woke up in the middle of the night in this trance-like state. He reached under his pillow, pulled out the revolver, and began firing at the guards right outside of the cell. And so this convinced the police that Robert had been telling the truth about what happened to Andre Monet. He really had killed him while he was sleepwalking. A decision was made not to prosecute Robert for the murder. Instead, they decided to basically exile him for everybody's protection. And so from then until 1937, when Robert died, he was forced to live alone on this secluded farm outside of Paris, where the only visitors he ever got were doctors who would only show up during the day and with armed bodyguards. In the early morning hours before sunrise on April 12, 1990, a 31-year-old man named Nathan Neesmith pushed down on the gas throttle of the fishing boat that he was steering just off the coast of Georgia. And as he did this, he expected the boat to naturally kind of kick into a higher gear and go faster. But as he pushed that throttle down, nothing really happened, and the boat just kind of sputtered along, going about half the speed that he expected it to go. Confused, Nathan stepped away and began making his way out towards the deck, where his younger brother, Billy Joe, who was actually the captain of this fishing boat, was out there taking a nap. And Nathan figured, if there was any issue with the boat, Billy Joe was the guy to talk to. He would know how to fix it. Now, for context, the two brothers were on the first day of a 7-day fishing trip that actually Nathan was not supposed to be a part of. The crew was originally going to be Billy Joe, the captain, and the one who actually rented the boat, along with Billy Joe's nephew, and also 2 other commercial fishermen. But at the last second, those 2 other commercial fishermen had bowed out, and Nathan and a friend had volunteered to go to round out the crew. Now, Nathan and Billy Joe, they came from a fishing family, but it was really only Billy Joe who had pursued the family business. Now, Nathan was perfectly handy out on the water and did know how to fish and knew his way around a fishing boat, but compared to Billy Joe, there was a massive gap in experience. Billy Joe was the fisherman, and Nathan really was not. But Nathan and Billy Joe were very close, and so as soon as Nathan heard Billy Joe was in trouble and needed some more fishermen, Nathan didn't hesitate to say he would do it. Because really, for their entire lives, that was sort of their dynamic. Even though Nathan was the older brother, it was Nathan who looked up to Billy Joe, and any chance he got, he would do anything to help Billy Joe. And Billy Joe really respected that and loved that about Nathan. But now, as Nathan made his way out to the deck to wake his brother up to tell him on the first day of the trip, right as Nathan's taken the wheel, that something's wrong with the boat and I can't fix it. And also, Nathan was enormous, like 250 pounds, well over 6 feet tall. He was huge, this big physical presence, but he really was not mechanically savvy at all. And so again, Nathan is sort of feeling like, sorry, and also maybe even second guessing whether or not it was even a good idea for him to have come along. If he can't even fix a minor issue with the throttle or the engine, what's he doing here? But when Nathan woke up his younger brother and explained the issue, Billy Joe was not upset. He was like, okay, we'll go down below and we'll take a look at the engine and make sure everything is okay. However, when they went down and Billy Joe opened up this hatch to look at the engine, smoke immediately came out, and it was very clear to Billy Joe anyways, that this was not like a minor issue. Something seriously was wrong with the engine. This was a big problem. And so Billy Joe began cussing, he's totally frustrated, and he just told Nathan to, go down below and tell the other two to wake up and come help. And so huge Nathan turned around and went down into the bunk room down below, and the second he got down to that level of the fishing boat, he just stopped because there was at least a foot of water in the hallway and in the bunk room when he went inside. And so Nathan screamed at the other two fishermen to get up, and so they got up and they're looking down, they're seeing all this water, and so they're starting to panic. And Nathan, he goes back upstairs and he yells to Billy Joe, who's dealing with this engine issue, that in addition to that, it appears the boat is also sinking. And so Billy Joe is like, get buckets, go down there and start bailing out the water. I'm going to call Mayday. And so Billy Joe runs back up to the steering wheel. He grabs the radio, and Nathan and the others can hear him yelling over and over again, Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. And as that was happening, Nathan and the other two fishermen put on their life vests, grabbed buckets, and went down below to begin manually bailing out the water. But the second they got down there, it was very obvious the water, wherever it was leaking into this ship, was coming in way faster than they could potentially bail out. But they kept doing it, getting the water out as fast as they could, trying to stay calm. They can hear Billy getting more and more frantic, yelling Mayday over and over again. And then all the lights inside of the ship began to flicker, and then they went out, and they were cast into total darkness. The engine basically had stopped, and it was just silence, just the sound of water rushing into this boat. Also, Billy Joe had stopped yelling Mayday because clearly the boat had lost power and the radio didn't work. And unfortunately, before the power cut out, nobody had heard any of Billy Joe's Mayday calls. So nobody knew where they were, nobody knew they were sinking, and without power, they had no way to communicate to anybody. They were totally alone. So Nathan, Billy Joe, and the others did the only thing they could do. They went up to the main deck, they grabbed their inflatable life raft, they blew it up, chucked it over the side, they grabbed as many supplies as they could, put it in the raft, they all made sure they had all their flotation on, and then they jumped into the life raft, abandoning the sinking fishing boat. Now, once all four men were safely inside of this life raft, they were not as panicked as you might think they would be, because they had put enough food and water in this raft to last them at least several days. They all again had their life vests on, so proper flotation, and even though nobody responded to those Mayday calls, it wasn't impossible to think that maybe somebody had heard the Mayday calls and they just had not called back. Maybe there was a rescue operation coming to their location right now. They didn't know, but it felt plausible that they could be rescued. They would just need to kind of ration out their supplies and stay optimistic. However, their optimism quickly faded when, after only being in this life raft for 30 minutes, right as the sun was starting to come up, Nathan began to hear a strange sound. And it was coming from somewhere in the life raft. He couldn't quite place the sound, and so at first he kind of tried to ignore it, but then he noticed the life raft was becoming softer. And then he realized the sound he heard was a small hiss. The raft had a leak. And even though the four men were able to trace the sound of this leak to the actual puncture, they didn't have a patch kit or any meaningful way to patch up this hole. And so all they could do was just put their hands over this leak and do their best to seal it. But it didn't stop the air from coming out. It just delayed it. And so over the next hour, again, as the sun is just coming up on the second day of their big fishing trip, the raft finally completely deflated, and all four men were suddenly bobbing in the freezing cold ocean, surrounded by the wreckage of their sinking fishing boat. And so eventually, the men grabbed the biggest piece of wood from the wreckage that came floating by, and it was buoyant enough that it kind of served as like a makeshift raft, but it wasn't buoyant enough to hold all four of them at once, which meant, they had to take turns resting on this raft, and then they'd have to get back in the ocean and kind of wait their turn again. Totally miserable. And as this was happening, they just stared at the hull of their sinking fishing boat that was still poking up out of the ocean, just drift farther and farther away from them because the current was pretty strong. And as they watched their ship just kind of disappear into the distance, and they're just kind of drifting out into the middle of the ocean, they were all just stunned into silence. They could not believe how this had happened, and so quickly. And also, what were they going to do? They're in the worst possible situation here. It just didn't seem possible that they could actually survive this. Now, for reference, even though the men had salvaged a lot of their food and water from the sinking life raft, and they had their flotation devices on, that didn't protect them from hypothermia. It wouldn't matter if it was super warm outside. What mattered is the ocean was really cold. And because they couldn't stay on that raft, they had to keep cycling through, going back in the ocean over and over again. It was just a matter of time before they would get hypothermia. And sometimes hypothermia can kick in just a couple of hours. I mean, we're not talking days here. This is going to be quick. And all these guys knew that. And so as these men were forced to have these really morbid discussions around who's going to stay in the water and who's going to stay on the raft, Nathan made a drastic decision. Nathan, being by far the biggest physically out of the 4 men, he knew that if he wasn't there right now, the other 3 could easily fit on their makeshift raft and stay out of the water, delaying hypothermia, thereby increasing the odds that they got rescued. And so Nathan did what he always did, and he turned to his younger brother, who he looked up to so much, who he just wanted to help all the time. And Nathan told him, I'm going to swim to the wreckage. I'm going to swim back to the hull of our sinking ship, and I'm going to fashion my own makeshift raft. That way you guys can have this one, and I'll have my own, and we can all get out of here in one piece. Now, keep in mind, it was fairly obvious that the hull of the sinking ship, which was barely visible near the horizon, was at least 3 miles away, just from their own rough calculations. So this is a monster swim to get to that. And so immediately, Billy Joe and the other 3 were like, no, that is a suicide mission. You cannot do that. Do not swim to the hull. You're not going to make it. Now, just to give some additional context here, if you're not familiar with just how challenging swimming in the open ocean is, I'm going to give you my limited experience. So when I was in the military, we had to do one 5.5-mile open ocean swim. And then also we did a whole bunch of 2-mile ocean swims. And even though we were allowed to use amazing wetsuits and fins, we had a swim partner with us. We had the land nearby to use as a reference to make sure we're going the right direction. We had food, we had water, we were in great shape. Even with all of that, open ocean swims are miserable. You get all the salt in your mouth and your nose, you start cramping and chafing. I mean, it takes hours and hours and hours to swim some of these distances, and you're constantly fighting against the waves. I mean, it is an absolute chore swimming in the open ocean, again, even with all the right stuff in place. And you gotta remember, Nathan is this big guy, he's got this big bulky life vest on that's gonna make it hard to swim. He doesn't have fins, he doesn't have a wetsuit, and he's got no landmarks around him, to make sure he's going in a straight line. Typically when you're swimming in the ocean, you're constantly looking at the land or some other landmark to make sure you're going in the right direction. He wouldn't have had that. And also it's this unknown distance he's covering, and there could be predators in the water. I mean, there's so many barriers here that basically there was like a 0% chance this swim would be successful. But Nathan totally understood what he was really doing here. He didn't really know if he was actually going to make it to that boat. Frankly, that was not really the point. What he was really doing was choosing to sacrifice himself to potentially save his brother and the other 2. And so even though they were telling him, do not go, do not swim in that direction, you're not going to make it, Nathan just turned to his brother Billy Joe and said, I love you. And then he turned and began swimming. And by some miracle, 11 hours later, right as the sun was setting, Nathan was still alive and still swimming, and he did reach the sinking boat that still had its hull poking out of the water. Now, when Nathan got to the sinking ship, he was almost dead from dehydration, from hypothermia. I mean, he's miserable, but he's made it to his destination completely against all odds, and he climbed up onto this hull, and he found a spot on the hull of the ship that supported his weight, and he managed to tie himself using some rope or maybe his life vest to the hull, so he was anchored in place. And then he didn't get to sleep because the whole time he's thinking, this thing could sink under the water at any point and it will drag me with it because I'm tied to it, or he could just drift off of it if his rigging kind of came undone, if he was asleep. And so all night, beyond exhausted, he's just holding on to this hull, not really sure what's going to happen, but here he is, just waiting it out. And then finally, when the sun came up that next morning, as Nathan looked around him, he's in the middle of the ocean, he sees in the direction he had come from this pillar of smoke coming up over the horizon. And so Nathan, he rubs his eyes. He can't believe it. He's thinking, there's no way. There's already a ship out here. We're in the middle of nowhere. But sure enough, slowly but surely, this massive freighter ship came into view that was very far away. It's not near Nathan, but he can see it clear as day. And where this ship was basically circling was roughly where he believed his brother and the other 2 fishermen were still floating. And so he's thinking, oh my goodness, the freighter is going to save them, and then it's going to come save me. And so Nathan just clung onto the hull and watched as this freighter made these big slow loops right around that same area. And then the freighter came to a full stop, and it appeared to lower something down into the water. It seemed very much like a full-blown rescue operation. And then about 3 hours after he first spotted this freighter, the freighter began to move again, and this time directly towards Nathan. Nathan was so relieved he could practically cry. But instead what he did is he thought, they're going to be here in a minute. I'm finally just going to close my eyes and go to sleep. And so he put his head down on the hull, looked one more time at the freighter, and then closed his eyes. Now, Nathan would be rescued, but it would not be by that huge freighter ship. Nathan eventually had opened his eyes after closing them for a second, and he saw this freighter that had been coming straight for him at some point had kind of deviated and gone in the wrong direction and then vanished over the horizon, never to be seen again. And it would take 3 more days before a separate ship happened to find Nathan. They scooped him up and they rescued him. But even though Nathan had been really crushed when that freighter had gone the wrong way, he held on to this idea that, that freighter had clearly rescued his brother and the other 2 fishermen. And certainly, even if they couldn't find him, they would go back and they would tell the authorities that Nathan is out there. He swam back to the hull of the ship. We got to go find him. And so certainly a rescue effort would be on the way. And it was true. A rescue boat had come out and found Nathan. So everything seemed to be tracking. And when Nathan woke up inside of his hospital room back on land, his friends and family were all by his bedside, and he's looking around. He can't believe he survived. And the first thing he asks is, how's my brother? How are the other 2 fishermen? And why didn't that freighter pick me up too? And at this, all the people in the room just kind of looked at Nathan with a very confused look on their face. And eventually they asked him a question that made Nathan burst out in tears. They said, what freighter? It would turn out Billy Joe and the other 2 fishermen were still missing at this point, and nobody had heard a thing about some big freighter in the area. As far as anybody knew, at least in Nathan's family, that freighter ship did not exist. The search for Billy Joe and the remaining 2 crew members went on for weeks and weeks, and while the active search out on the ocean was going on, the Coast Guard and police were searching through every record they could possibly find of basically any ship that was even roughly in the area where Nathan and the others had been. But despite looking everywhere, there was basically no sign that any ship of any kind had been there beyond the rescue operation that eventually scooped up Nathan. And so again, it seemed very likely that that freighter ship didn't exist. And, it was possible that Nathan, in his very deteriorated state, had maybe hallucinated it. Although Nathan was adamant, he definitely saw that ship. It did not feel like, a multi-hour long hallucination. It felt like he was watching a ship. He was sure of it. But again, there was just no proof, and so nobody knew what to think of that. And then eventually, even though there was this huge search going on, there was just no sign of Billy Joe or the others. And so eventually the search was called off, and unfortunately, the presumption was Billy Joe and the other 2 were now dead. 5 months later, on the afternoon of October 5th, 1990, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home. Now, by this point, the victims' families had all tried to sort of restart their lives following this tragedy, but deep down, none of them could truly accept that Billy Joe and the other 2 fishermen were just gone. They just couldn't do it. It was too soon. It felt like, any moment they were going to get news that, they had been rescued by some freighter ship or something. And so anytime a phone rang in any of these families' homes, it's like they would rush to the phone with the sense of hope that this time it's going to be different. Their loved ones are going to be okay, only to obviously be crushed when that was not the case. But on this day, on October 5th, that phone call that came through in Nathan's sister's home, that one was different. When Nathan's mother picked up this phone call in Nathan's sister's home, she answered it and said hello, and right away she thought, oh, this has to be a wrong number, because the person who was calling was speaking in rapid Spanish, and she didn't understand what they were saying. But as she was about to hang up, the caller, intermittently throughout their rapid Spanish, began saying something in English that Nathan's mother could understand, and it totally shocked her. The caller kept saying Nathan's sister's name over and over again, followed by Nathan's sister's phone number, like on repeat, the name, the phone number in English over and over and over again. And Nathan's mom is so caught off guard by this that she just listened, not even sure what to do. And then before she could ask any follow-up questions, the caller cut the line and the phone call was over. And then a few minutes later, another phone rang in a home that was not far away from Nathan's sister's home. And this other home belonged to the boat owner who Billy Joe had rented the fishing boat from that unfortunately sank and caused this whole tragedy. And so this boat owner, he picks up the phone, he answers it, and just like the call that had come through in Nathan's sister's house, this call was the same. It was somebody calling, speaking rapid Spanish, and the boat owner was about to hang up when he heard something that he understood because it was in English. And what he heard was his own name followed by his phone number over and over and over again. Basically the same type of call that Nathan's mom had just heard. And then before the boat owner could ask any questions, the line went dead. Now, one phone call like this, you could chalk up to maybe a prank or a wrong number or just a really weird coincidence. But to have those two calls happen within minutes of each other and basically take on the exact same form, but different names and different phone numbers, it just seemed way too coincidental to not be somehow connected to the missing fisherman. Because the link between these two households where these calls came in was the doomed fishing trip. And these calls did not stop. Every few weeks after this first time these calls came through, the phone would ring in Nathan's sister's house or in the boat owner's house, and it would be the same thing all over again. Rapid Spanish followed by either Nathan's sister's name and then her phone number, or the boat owner's name and his phone number. Just like that for weeks and weeks and weeks. And so as soon as this started happening, Nathan's family and the boat owner, they figured out they were both getting these weird calls, and they contacted authorities, which kind of restarted the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman, because now it seemed very plausible that maybe Nathan really had seen a freighter, and that freighter really had picked up Billy Joe and the others, and maybe they had been taken to another country, a Spanish-speaking country, and maybe people were trying to get in touch with the families now to get them back home. Or, of course, there could be a negative side to this, that maybe they were captured by some rogue vessel and were being held by these people who were calling. I mean, there's any number of theories, but it made authorities wonder, hey, what's going on here? And so authorities got in touch with Mexican authorities and other Spanish-speaking country authorities and tried to figure out if there was any chance that there was, a vessel out there around the time that Billy Joe and the others were missing that in theory could have maybe illegally been in that area or something. But despite this kind of exhaustive effort to kind of look again to see if maybe there was a freighter in that area, there was just no evidence that there was. It made no sense, but the authorities said, look, we have no idea what these calls are about. We still do not think that freighter or any ship that even resembled a freighter was out there. We still believe that Billy Joe and the others are dead. But as for the victims' families, they just didn't buy that. They really believed that these strange phone calls were somehow connected to Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. Specifically, these calls must signal that Billy Joe and the others were still alive. They just had no evidence to support that. That is, until March 6th, 1991, so almost a year after the doomed fishing vessel sank and Billy Joe and the others went missing. On that day, the phone rang inside of Nathan's sister's home, and she answered it, and it was the voice who spoke in rapid Spanish, but this time they spoke in perfect English, and all they said was, "I'm bringing him home." And then the line went dead. And Nathan's sister screamed and she yelled for her husband to call police. They contacted the authorities. And again, it kind of brought back to life the search for Billy Joe and the missing fisherman. And then after this call, there was a near constant presence of authorities on the Georgia coastline, basically looking out to the water, waiting, hoping for Billy Joe and the others to return. But unfortunately, they never did. And following that last phone call where the caller spoke in perfect English and said, "I'm bringing him home," after that, the call stopped. And so to this day, no one has ever been able to actually figure out what happened to Billy Joe and the other two fishermen. They are presumed dead at this point, but there's this one nagging question that surrounds the whole story, and that is, what did Nathan see? Was that actually a freighter picking up Billy Joe and the others? And if so, what did they do with them? Or was Nathan just hallucinating? It's entirely possible, but Nathan has always said he knows what he saw, and that was not a hallucination. As for the families of the victims, they still firmly believe that their loved ones are still out there, and someday they will come back home, and the families just hope they're alive long enough to be there for the reunion.
At approximately 4:30 a.m., on the 5th of June, 1960, on the shores of Lake Bodom, just outside Helsinki, Finland, 4 teenagers were sleeping shoulder to shoulder inside a small tent deep in the quiet forest. Only minutes later, the darkness was ripped apart by the sound of a knife slicing through the thick canvas, followed by a series of devastating blows crashing down from outside. By sunrise, 3 of them were dead in positions so horrifying that few could bear to look for long, while the sole survivor would spend more than 4 decades under suspicion as the prime suspect. But if he was truly the killer, why did a jury ultimately find him not guilty? And if he was innocent, then who was the blonde-haired man seen leaving the scene that morning? Every secret controversy and chilling detail surrounding this case will be revealed by the end of the story. And in today's video, we will explore 5 cases involving mysterious and highly controversial deaths. Before we get into today's story, if you are a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you have come to the right place, because that is all we do. And we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that is of interest to you, please invite the like button over for a nice backyard barbecue. But when it is time to eat, only serve them plain hot dog buns and room temperature tap water. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you do not miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let us get into today's story. On a Friday afternoon, June 4th, 1968, teen-year-old Seppo Boisman stood in his driveway in a small town just outside of Helsinki, Finland, wiping down the chrome on his motorcycle. He was really proud of this bike, and he spent a lot of time working on it, making sure the engine was tuned perfectly. He and his best friend, an 18-year-old guy named Nils Gustafsson, had been planning a weekend camping trip for weeks. They were taking their motorcycles out to the country, and they were bringing their girlfriends along. Seppo was dating 15-year-old Anja Mäki, and Nils was dating 15-year-old Mela Björklund. The girls spent the entire afternoon packing their bags. They packed their bathing suits, a couple of towels, some sandwiches wrapped in paper, and a few glass bottles of lemonade. Nils, wanting to impress everyone, had actually managed to get his hands on a bottle of liquor, which he packed securely in his leather saddlebag. By mid-afternoon, they all met up. The girls climbed onto the backs of the motorcycles, wrapping their arms around Seppo and Nils, and they took off down the roads, heading away from the city. Their destination was Lake Bodom. It was a large, very deep lake, surrounded by thick forests of birch and pine. There were a few scattered farmhouses in the general area and a local kiosk where people could buy sodas, but for the most part, it was just open nature. When they arrived, they rode their bikes down a narrow dirt trail until they found the perfect spot. It was a small peninsula that jutted out into the water, meaning they had the lake on 3 sides of them and a thick wall of trees directly behind them. They parked the bikes near the tree line and pulled out their tent. It was, a standard-issue heavy canvas ridge tent with guy ropes and wooden pegs. The boys hammered the pegs into the soft soil right near the edge of the water. Once the tent was up, they all changed into their bathing suits and jumped into the lake. The water was still pretty cold since it was only early June, so they did not stay in long. They came back to the shore, dried off, and opened up the sandwiches. Seppo and Nils passed the bottle of liquor back and forth a few times, just talking about school, their bikes, and what they wanted to do that summer. As the sun started to go down, the temperature dropped significantly. They gathered up their trash, put their shoes outside the tent flaps, and crawled inside. It was a tent really meant for 2, maybe 3 people at most, so with 4 teenagers inside, it was incredibly cramped. They had to lie shoulder to shoulder completely flat on their backs just to fit. But they were tired from the ride and the swimming, and pretty soon all 4 of them were fast asleep. The next morning, June 5th, around 6 in the morning, 2 young boys were walking along a dirt path on the opposite side of the lake. They had woken up early to look for birds. As they walked, they looked across the water toward the peninsula. Through the trees, they could see the 2 motorcycles parked where Seppo and Nils had left them. They also saw the tent, but the tent was not standing up anymore. It was completely collapsed, lying flat against the ground. And walking away from the collapsed tent, heading into the dense woods, was a man with light blonde hair. The boys just figured, the campers were awake and packing up their site early, so they did not really think much of it and just kept on walking. A few hours later, around 11 in the morning, a local carpenter named Risto Siren was taking his dog for a walk near the same area. As they approached the peninsula, the dog suddenly started acting very agitated. It was pulling hard on the leash, whining, and trying to drag Risto toward the campsite. Risto let the dog lead him through the trees. He saw the motorcycles first, and then he saw the tent. The heavy canvas was completely shredded. There were long, jagged slashes all over the roof and the sides, and the fabric was entirely soaked in large, dark red stains. Risto immediately dropped the leash, turned around, and sprinted to the nearest farmhouse to use their telephone to call the police. When the local investigators arrived, they stood around the collapsed tent, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. They carefully grabbed the edges of the heavy canvas and lifted it up. Underneath were the bodies of Mila, Anja, and Seppo. They had all sustained massive blunt force trauma to their heads, and they had been stabbed dozens of times. Mela, specifically, had taken the absolute worst of the attack. But as the police were examining the scene, they realized there was a 4th person. Nils was lying directly on top of the collapsed canvas. He was bleeding heavily from his head, his jaw was visibly broken, and his face was severely swollen, but his chest was slowly moving. He was barely breathing. The officers immediately called for an ambulance, and Nils was rushed to the surgical hospital in Helsinki. The crime scene investigators started combing the area. The first thing they noticed was how bizarre the attack was. Based on the slash marks and the blood spatter, the attacker had never actually gone inside the tent. They had stood on the outside and just blindly swung a knife and some sort of heavy blunt object, like a rock or a metal pipe, downward onto the sleeping teenagers right through the fabric. But neither the knife nor the blunt object were left behind at the scene. They also noticed that several items were missing. Seppo's leather jacket was gone, the keys to both motorcycles were gone, and Nils's shoes were missing. The police could not figure out why someone would physically assault 4 people and then steal a pair of shoes. They brought in tracking dogs and let them sniff around the campsite. The dogs immediately picked up a trail and led the officers into the woods. About half a mile away from the campsite, the dogs stopped at a small ditch. Hidden inside the ditch, the police found Nils's missing shoes completely covered in blood, along with pieces of clothing that belonged to Seppo. The police waited for days at the hospital for Nils to wake up, hoping he could tell them what happened. When he finally regained consciousness, his memory was completely fragmented. He told the detectives that he remembered going to sleep. Then, he remembered waking up to a sudden, explosive pain in his head. And for just a split second, he remembered seeing a pair of eyes staring at him through a hole in the canvas. He said the eyes looked like they were glowing red in the dark. And after that, he just completely blacked out. The police started aggressively interviewing people in the area. Their first major suspect was a local man named Valdemar Gillstrom. Valdemar ran a small kiosk near the lake where he sold sodas and snacks. He was very well known in the community because he absolutely hated the people who came to camp at the lake. He would frequently yell at them, his face getting completely red with anger. He would throw rocks at their tents, and he had even been caught sneaking up to campsites in the middle of the night and cutting the guy ropes to make the tents collapse on the people sleeping inside. A few years after the murders, Valdemar actually confessed to his neighbor that he was the one who killed the teenagers at Lake Bodom. But the very next day, before the police could question him about the confession, Valdemar walked out into Lake Bodom and drowned himself. The police did look into his background, but his wife swore that he was in bed with her the entire night of the murders. So the police eventually just moved on. Their second suspect was a man named Hans Assmann. On June 6th, the day after the bodies were found, Hans walked into the surgical hospital in Helsinki. He was acting completely erratic. He kept kind of pretending to fall unconscious. And when the doctors tried to take his vitals or ask him questions, he actively resisted pulling his arms away and refusing to speak. The medical staff noticed that his fingernails were packed with thick black dirt, and his clothes had multiple dark red stains soaking right into the threads. The doctors were so suspicious of his behavior that they locked him in a room and called the police. When investigators looked at Hans, they realized he perfectly matched the description of the blonde man that the 2 young boys had seen walking away from the tent. There were also rumors circulating in the community that Hans was a KGB spy, but when the detectives interviewed him, he gave them an alibi that they apparently accepted. They let him walk right out of the hospital, and they never even tested the red stains on his clothes. And so, without the murder weapons, without a clear motive, and with their best suspects cleared, the investigation just stalled. Years turned into decades. The files were put into storage boxes, and the case of the Lake Bodom murders went completely cold. But then, in 2004, 44 years after the murders took place, the Finnish police held a press conference and made an announcement that shocked the entire country. They announced that they had finally made an arrest in the Lake Bodom murders. The suspect they had taken into custody was a man in his early 60s. It was Nils Gustafsson, the sole survivor of the attack. Over the decades, forensic technology had advanced significantly. The police had decided to reopen the case and run modern DNA tests on all the physical evidence that they had kept in storage. Specifically, they looked at Nils's shoes, the ones that had been found hidden in a ditch half a mile away from the campsite. The tests showed that the shoes were heavily covered in the blood of Mila, Anya, and Seppo. But there was absolutely no blood from Nils on the outside of those shoes. The investigators realized that whoever committed the murders had to be wearing those shoes during the attack in order for them to be covered in the victim's blood. But if Nils was wearing them, his own blood should have been on them as well, considering how badly he was bleeding at the scene. The police concluded that the only logical explanation was that Nils committed the murders while wearing his own shoes, took them off to avoid getting his own blood on them when he staged his injuries, and hid them in the woods. Based on the theory presented by the prosecution in court, here is a reconstruction of what they believed happened on the morning of June 5, 1960. Around 4 in the morning, Nils and Seppo woke up in the cramped tent. They had both been drinking the liquor from Nils's saddlebag, and they got into a heated argument. The argument quickly escalated and turned physical. Seppo, being a bit bigger, got the upper hand and kicked Nils out of the tent. Nils stood outside in the cold morning air, humiliated and absolutely furious. He paced around the campsite, his anger just boiling over until he, completely snapped. He walked down to the edge of the water and picked up a large, heavy rock from the shoreline. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his folding knife. Then he slipped his shoes back on and walked back up to the tent. He did not bother untying the flaps to go inside. He just stood over the canvas and started swinging. He brought the heavy rock down as hard as he could, smashing it into his best friend and the two girls. He slashed downward with the knife, ripping the fabric to shreds. Completely blind to who he was hitting, just striking over and over again until the screaming stopped, and no one inside the tent was moving. When it was finally quiet, he dropped the rock and realized what he had just done. He knew he needed a cover story. He took off his shoes, which were now heavily spattered with blood, and walked half a mile into the woods to hide them in a ditch. Hoping the police would think a robber had taken them, he threw the rock, the knife, and the motorcycle keys far out into the deep water of the lake. Then he walked back to the campsite, lay down directly on top of the collapsed, blood-soaked tent, and picked up a smaller rock. To make the story of an outside attacker believable, he repeatedly smashed the rock into his own face, breaking his jaw and fracturing his facial bones, until he passed out from the pain. He just lay there until Risto Siren and his dog found him hours later. That was the exact narrative the prosecution presented during the trial in 2005. But Nils's defense attorneys immediately went to work, tearing it apart. They brought in a team of medical experts who reviewed Nils's original hospital records from 1960. These experts testified that the extent of Nils's facial fractures, the severe concussion, and the massive swelling were so extreme that it was physically impossible for him to have inflicted those injuries on himself. Furthermore, the doctors stated that with a concussion and fractures that severe, Nils would have lost all motor function. He would not have been able to walk half a mile into the woods to hide a pair of shoes, and he certainly would not have been able to walk back to the campsite. The jury agreed with the medical experts. In October of 2005, Nils Gustafsson was fully acquitted of all charges. He was immediately released, and the Finnish government paid him a substantial financial settlement for the time he had wrongfully spent in prison. To this day, the police have no other active suspects. Modern DNA testing on the shredded tent fabric did reveal the presence of blood from the victims, along with a small trace of DNA belonging to one unidentified male. But that profile has never matched anyone in any database. The true identity of the person who stood outside that tent at Lake Bodom and bludgeoned 3 teenagers to death remains completely unknown. And while the idea of a violent stranger emerging from the woods in the middle of the night is something that stays with you, sometimes the most brutal acts of violence do not happen in the dark. Sometimes they happen right in the middle of a crowded arena, while thousands of people are watching. In the middle of a damp, overcast week in November of 1964, 40-year-old Esther Castellani was sitting on the edge of her bed in Vancouver, Canada, trying to tie her shoes. But her fingers were tingling and numb, and she just could not get her hands to cooperate. She had been feeling completely exhausted for days, and now a strange metallic taste was lingering in the back of her throat. She figured she was just coming down with a bad case of the winter flu, so she decided to lie back down on the pillows and wait for her husband to come home from work. Now, her husband was a man named Rene Castellani, and he was easily one of the most recognizable people in the entire city. Rene was a prominent radio personality for the local station CKNW, and he was known for being incredibly charismatic, loud, and deeply involved in local charity work. He was the kind of guy who could walk into any crowded room and instantly become the center of attention, telling jokes and shaking hands with everyone. When he got home that evening and saw his wife pale and shivering under the blankets, he immediately went into the kitchen to mix her a hot drink, promising that he would take care of everything. But over the next few weeks, Esther's condition did not get any better at all, and in fact, it began to drastically decline to a point that left her completely housebound. The mild flu symptoms transformed into severe, agonizing stomach cramps that would make her double over in tears on the living room floor, followed by constant vomiting and a relentless burning sensation in her chest that no amount of water could ever seem to cool down. Renee brought in a local family doctor to examine her at the house multiple times, but the doctor was completely puzzled by what he was seeing. unable to find any clear skin rashes or typical signs of infection. He gave her some basic medication for a stomach ulcer and told her to rest. But within days, Esther was so weak she could barely stand up on her own to walk to the bathroom, and her skin began to take on a strange, sickly yellow tint. By the time the early spring of 1965 rolled around, Rene realized that his wife needed serious medical attention that went far beyond basic home visits. So he had her officially admitted to the Vancouver General Hospital. A large team of specialized doctors and internal medicine experts immediately took over her daily care, running dozens of blood tests, abdominal x-rays, and physical examinations around the clock. They looked closely at her digestive tract, wondering if she had somehow contracted a rare, aggressive form of stomach cancer that was spreading undetected, or perhaps an exotic tropical virus that she had picked up during a brief trip across the border years ago. But every single diagnostic test scan and culture they ran came back completely negative, leaving the medical staff totally empty-handed and incredibly frustrated as they watched her white blood cell count fluctuate wildly. So the hospital analysts began to look into potential environmental factors outside of the hospital walls, suspecting that she was being exposed to some kind of industrial toxin in her everyday life. They sent city inspectors to the Castellani home to check the entire property for any hidden dangers or chemical leaks. They tested the old copper water pipes in the basement to see if lead or heavy minerals were leaching into the drinking water. And they tore open the kitchen pantry to inspect her canned goods for botulism or accidental food contamination from bad manufacturing batches. They even looked into a recent batch of groceries delivered to the house, questioning the local market clerks and delivery drivers to see if any other families in the immediate neighborhood were suffering from similar symptoms after eating the same food. But once again, every single lab report and environmental test came back perfectly clean, showing absolutely no signs of standard household poisons or heavy contamination. And while Esther was lying in that sterile hospital bed hooked up to constant intravenous fluids and slowly wasting away to little more than a skeleton, Rene was busy managing his highly successful public life. He went on the radio every single afternoon for his regular broadcast at the CKNW studio, but instead of his usual cheerful, upbeat routines and comedic stories, he began sharing the intimate, painful details of his wife's mystery illness. With his thousands of loyal listeners across the province, he would choke up right on the microphone, his voice cracking with deep emotion as he described how hard Esther was fighting in the ward and how completely heartbroken he was to watch her suffer day after day without any answers from the doctors. The entire city of Vancouver became absolutely captivated by this tragic real-time story, and listeners began flooding the radio station's front desk with letters of support, home-cooked meals for Rene, and handmade blankets. Keep Esther warm in her hospital room. Rene became the absolute model of a devoted, grieving husband in the eyes of the public, spending hours sitting by Esther's bedside every single evening, holding her hand and feeding her small spoonfuls of ice cream or sips of cold vanilla milkshakes, which were the only things she could seem to keep down without experiencing immediate stomach pain. The nurses on the ward would watch him through the small glass window of the room, constantly commenting to one another on how incredibly patient, loving, and supportive he was during this nightmare. But despite the excellent hospital care, the round-the-clock monitoring, and Rene's constant attention, Esther just kept getting worse as the weeks dragged on. Her beautiful hair began to fall out in thick clumps on her pillow, leaving large bald patches on her scalp. And the skin on the soles of her feet began to crack and peel away in deep, painful layers that bled whenever she tried to shift her weight in the bed. On July 11th, 1965, after months of enduring this agonizing, unexplained pain, Esther's heart finally stopped beating in the middle of the night, and she passed away. Rene was completely devastated at the bedside, weeping openly and slamming his fists against the wall as the doctors officially pronounced her dead. Because the medical staff had been so thoroughly baffled by her symptoms for nearly a year and had no definitive answers, they listed her official cause of death on the certificate as a combination of acute gastroenteritis and sudden, unexplained liver failure. The funeral was a massive public event in Vancouver, with hundreds of regular radio listeners showing up to stand in the pouring rain at the cemetery crying alongside Rene as his wife's casket was lowered into the muddy ground. But just a few short weeks after the funeral concluded, the entire public perception of the grieving husband began to completely fall apart into a major scandal. People in the community and neighbors on their street were absolutely shocked when Rene suddenly announced that he was getting married again less than a single month after his wife had been buried. His new bride was a 22-year-old woman named Lolly Miller. who worked as the main receptionist at the very same radio station where Renee had his daily show. And people quickly realized that they had been spending a lot of time together behind closed doors while Esther was still alive. And almost immediately after the quick, private wedding ceremony was finalized. Renee took Lolly on an incredibly lavish, expensive honeymoon to Disneyland in California, spending thousands of dollars on luxury hotels, fine dining, and expensive gifts. Now, this incredibly rapid change in behavior did not just upset the radio listeners who felt manipulated, it also caught the attention of a brilliant pathologist at the Vancouver General Hospital named Dr. John Eden. Dr. Eden had been deeply unsettled by Esther's death because he prided himself on finding medical answers, and the fact that a 40-year-old woman could waste away and die in a modern hospital facility without a single doctor understanding the root cause was something that kept him up at night. So, when he heard about the sudden marriage and the lavish trip to Disneyland, something inside his head just clicked, and he realized that the symptoms she exhibited matched a historical pattern of a specific type of chemical intervention. He decided to go back into the hospital's basement storage facility, where they kept preserved tissue samples and fluid blocks from deceased patients, determined to run the one test they had overlooked. Dr. Eden pulled Esther's glass slides and preserved tissue blocks from the metal shelf and ran a highly specialized, comprehensive heavy metal toxicology screen that the hospital had not utilized during her initial admission because nobody had suspected foul play. And when the laboratory results came back a few days later, Dr. Eden walked straight to his desk with a pale face and immediately called the Homicide Division of the Vancouver Police Department. The tests revealed that Esther's body did not fail because of a natural disease, a hidden cancer, or a mystery virus. Her internal organs, including her liver, kidneys, and brain tissue, were completely saturated with massive lethal concentrations of arsenic, a highly toxic chemical element that had been systematically and deliberately introduced into her food and drink over the course of several months. The police immediately launched a massive homicide investigation, and their very first step was to secure a search warrant for the Castellani property and dig deep into Renee's financial and personal records. Detectives began tracking down local business owners across the city, interviewing garden supply stores, hardware shops, and commercial nurseries across the greater Vancouver area to check their poison registries. And at a small commercial nursery located just a few miles from the CKNW radio station, an investigator struck gold while flipping through the yellowed pages of the logbook. They found a sales entry showing that a man matching Renee's exact physical description, height, and voice had walked into the shop a few months prior and purchased a large commercial-grade container of an arsenic-based weed killer. The buyer had signed a fake name and address on the hazardous chemical registry, but a handwriting expert quickly compared the signature directly to Renee's official employment contracts and proved it was a perfect match. Renee Castellani was arrested by a team of detectives the exact moment his flight landed back in Vancouver from his California honeymoon, and he was immediately put on trial for capital murder in one of the most sensational, highly publicized court cases in Canadian history. Throughout the entire trial, Renee maintained his innocence, sitting calmly in his expensive suit, while his defense lawyers argued that Esther must have accidentally consumed the poison herself through a cosmetic product, or that the hospital had somehow mismanaged her treatment in the ward. But the prosecution had an overwhelming mountain of physical evidence, financial records, and witness testimony from the radio station staff that painted a completely different dark clinical picture for the jury. Based on the forensic reports, the store registries, and the hospital visitor logs, here is a reconstruction of what the police believe actually happened inside that suburban home and the hospital room in 1965. The man had become completely obsessed with the young receptionist at his station, and he knew that his wife would never grant him a clean divorce without a massive public scandal that would completely destroy his lucrative radio career, his clean public image. So, he decided that the only way out of his marriage was to eliminate his wife entirely, but he had to do it in a slow, agonizing way that would look completely natural to the outside world, mimicking a chronic wasting illness. He went to the local nursery and purchased the arsenic-based weed killer, bringing the toxic chemical back to his house in secret and hiding it in the garage. Every single evening, while his wife was resting in bed and complaining of fatigue, he would go into the kitchen and prepare her a special, refreshing treat to help ease her burning throat and give her some comfort. He would scoop vanilla ice cream into a blender, add whole milk, and then carefully measure out a small, precise dose of the odorless, tasteless white arsenic powder, blending it completely into the thick mixture so it could not be detected. He would then walk into the bedroom with a warm, loving smile, handing the glass to his wife, who would look up at him with total gratitude, thanking him for being such a wonderful, caring husband while she swallowed the very substance that was destroying her cells. And even after she was admitted to the hospital and placed under medical care, he kept the deadly routine going without missing a single day, utilizing the open visiting hours to bring her fresh homemade milkshakes from the outside, under the pretense that he was trying to keep her strength up. He was slowly destroying her internal organs bit by bit while he stood right in front of the medical staff, chatting with the nurses and playing the part of a saint. He used his daily radio broadcasts to weaponize the public's sympathy, building a massive wall of public grief that ensured nobody would ever look at him with suspicion while he was actively executing his wife in plain sight. In late 1965, the jury deliberated for only a few hours before finding Rene Castellani guilty of capital murder, and he was subsequently sentenced to life in prison with hard labor for his crimes. He spent decades behind bars, consistently denying his actions and trying to launch appeals until he was eventually released on parole in 1989, before dying of natural causes several years later. He thought he had executed the perfect invisible crime by using a slow, silent weapon that left no visible marks, completely operating under the assumption that his public charm and his radio audience's tears would shield him forever from the consequences of his own calculated brutality. But sometimes the deadliest intentions do not hide inside a glass bottle, a slow illness, or a toxic chemical powder. Sometimes a person's deepest rage breaks out all at once, transforming a crowded public gathering filled with joy, music, and laughter into a massive roaring inferno of deliberate destruction in a single, sudden instant. On a warm December afternoon in 1961, a father named Paulo walked down a bustling concrete avenue in the coastal city of Niterói, Brazil, holding the hands of his two young children, 8-year-old Gabriel, 6-year-old Sofia. The summer heat was dense and heavy, causing the children's skin to glisten as they hurried along the sidewalk, darting past street vendors who were selling chilled fruit and thick slices of watermelon from wooden push carts. Gabriel and Sofia were barely paying attention to the large crowds around them because their eyes were fixed entirely on the colorful paper flyers plastered onto the concrete walls of the neighborhood buildings. They had been talking about this specific day for over a month, and inside Paulo's trouser pocket were 3 paper admission tickets that had taken him weeks of careful budgeting to purchase from his modest salary as a local shipping clerk. They turned a sharp corner and finally came into view of a massive open dirt lot near the center of the neighborhood where a sprawling city of transport trucks, wooden cages, and support vehicles had assembled. Towering over the entire lot was the crown jewel of the presentation, an enormous nylon tent belonging to the Gran Circo Norte Americano. The fabric structure was absolutely massive, its bright red and white stripes stretching hundreds of feet into the blue sky. Held aloft by a complex network of thick iron support poles and heavy hemp cables anchored deep into the soil. A large crowd of families had already gathered around the perimeter, creating a long line that snaked toward the main entrance flaps, where a ticket collector in a red vest was methodically tearing paper stubs and ushering guests inside. Paulo checked his watch, noting that they were right on time for the grand afternoon performance, and he smiled as his children pulled him eagerly toward the back of the queue. Once they stepped inside, the sheer scale of the structure was overwhelming, with rows of elevated wooden bleachers circling a massive 3-ring performance floor covered in a thick layer of fresh golden sawdust. The tent was designed to accommodate over 3,000 spectators, and on this particular afternoon, every single wooden bench was packed tight with excited parents and children sitting shoulder to shoulder. The air inside the enclosed space was warm and thick, filled with the rich scents of hot popcorn, roasted peanuts, and sugarcane syrup being spun into large mounds of pink cotton candy. Near the center ring, a live brass band dressed in matching blue uniforms began tuning their instruments, the deep rumbles of the tubas and the sharp trills of the trumpets echoing loudly off the high, wax-coated canvas roof overhead. Paulo guided his children up the wooden steps to a middle row of the bleachers, helping them sit down before settling in between them, listening to the rhythmic waving of thousands of paper fans in the crowd. The lights around the perimeter dimmed slightly, and the show kicked off with a massive parade of acrobats, exotic animals and performers, clad in sparkling sequined costumes that caught the bright beams of the spotlights. Clowns moved through the narrow aisles between the bleachers, turning somersaults and tossing small pieces of wrapped hard candy into the lower rows, causing waves of laughter to ripple through the audience. Paulo watched his son Gabriel, pointing excitedly at a trio of performers balancing precariously on giant wooden spheres, while Sophia cheered as a group of trained dogs performed synchronized leaps through small hoops. The applause from the 3,000 people inside was deafening, a continuous roar of cheers that bounced off the heavy, dark fabric ceiling, creating an absolute wall of joy that made the long weeks of saving every spare coin completely worth it for Paulo. The show transitioned through several more elaborate acts, building up to the most anticipated portion of the afternoon, the Grand Trapeze performance. High up near the highest peak of the tent, 2 narrow wooden platforms were suspended from thin steel cables, and the performers began climbing the rope ladders, their glittering capes catching the intense white glare of the overhead lights. The entire arena went completely silent as the first catcher swung out over the sawdust rings. The crowd, holding its collective breath as an acrobat, launched himself into the air, turning 2 complete flips before being caught by his wrists. But as Paulo leaned forward to watch the next stunt, he noticed a sudden change in the air, a sharp, chemical odor that cut right through the sweet scent of popcorn and cotton candy. He blinked, rubbing his eyes as a faint haze began to drift across the upper rows of the bleachers near the main entrance flaps. He looked down toward the structural base of the tent near the main exit corridors and saw a small patch of orange light flickering violently along the vertical fabric of the wall. Before he could even point it out to the person sitting next to him, the small flame licked the lower edge of the heavy wax-coated canvas roof, and the entire ceiling erupted. The thick paraffin wax that had been applied to the nylon to make it waterproof acted like raw fuel, causing the fire to race across the roof structure in a massive, expanding wave of heat. Within seconds, large sheets of melting, burning nylon began to separate from the frame, raining down onto the wooden bleachers and the clothing of the screaming spectators below. The brass music stopped instantly, as the 3,000 people panicked all at once, rushing blindly toward the narrow exit ramps while the heavy wooden support beams began to buckle and snap under the intense heat. By sunset, Chief Investigator Carlos Roca stood in the center of the smoldering blackened clearing where the magnificent tent had stood just hours earlier. The structure was completely gone, reduced to a twisted heap of charred iron poles, melted synthetic fibers, and a thick layer of gray ash that covered the entire dirt lot. Dozens of paramedics, local firefighters, and soot-stained volunteers were moving methodically through the debris, lifting heavy pieces of collapsed wood and carrying wrapped bundles toward a fleet of waiting ambulances. The final casualty count was staggering, with over 500 people confirmed dead, the vast majority of them being young children who had been trapped near the rear bleachers when the main exit canvas collapsed inward, cutting off any exit escape. Carlos knelt down near the edge of the perimeter, picking up a fragment of unburned rope, lifting it to his nose, and noting a very specific chemical residue that did not belong to a circus performance. The local government quickly issued a public press release suggesting that the disaster was a tragic accidental equipment failure likely caused by a stray cigarette dropped near the generator trucks or a sudden electrical short circuit, the high-voltage spotlight grid. Carlos and his team of detectives set up a temporary operations center inside a vacant schoolhouse down the street, determined to look into every single detail before accepting the accident theory. They brought in the circus manager, along with the head of technical operations, for hours of intensive questioning about the safety protocols. The technical manager was visibly distraught, his hands shaking as he presented the official inspection logs, proving that the entire electrical grid was brand new and shielded by heavy rubber insulation. He explained that the main circuit breakers had tripped automatically the exact second the fire started, meaning an electrical fault could not have provided enough sustained energy to ignite the heavy canvas roof so instantly. The detectives then shifted their focus to the manufacturing process of the tent, investigating whether a faulty batch of paraffin waterproofing wax could have caused a spontaneous chemical reaction under the hot summer sun. They tracked down the chemical supplier in Rio de Janeiro, spending 2 full days analyzing shipping, manifests, laboratory certificates, and production receipts. The record showed that the exact same batch of wax had been sold to 4 other commercial operations across the region, and none of those structures had reported any issues, completely ruling out a manufacturing defect. Next, they looked into a tip about a group of local teenage boys who had been seen arguing with a security guard near the fuel storage tanks right before the show. The detectives brought the teenagers into the station, but after verified interviews with a neighborhood shopkeeper, they confirmed the boys were buying sodas blocks away when the flames erupted, leaving Carlos with a pile of dead ends. Carlos was sitting at his desk late into the evening, staring at a diagram of the collapsed exit corridors, when an old circus laborer walked into the station asking to speak with the lead investigator. The laborer was hesitant, looking around nervously, but he said he had witnessed a very hostile interaction 48 hours before the grand opening that the police needed to know about. He explained that one of the temporary workers hired from the local docks to help raise the heavy iron support poles had gotten into a violent dispute with the circus manager. This particular worker had been caught attempting to steal expensive brass fittings from the equipment trucks and had turned up to the job site completely intoxicated. The manager had publicly fired the man in front of the entire crew, refusing to pay his daily wage, and had ordered 2 security guards to physically throw him off the property. As the worker was being dragged through the dirt gates, he had turned back and screamed that he would make sure the circus never left the city alive. The laborer did not know the disgruntled man's legal name, only that other workers on the docks referred to him by a specific neighborhood moniker. Carlos immediately dispatched his team of detectives to canvass the bars, boarding houses, and cargo warehouses near the harbor district, showing a physical description to anyone who would look. After hours of rejection, a tavern owner near the shipping piers recognized the description and confirmed that the fired worker had been sitting in his back booth the night before the disaster, drinking heavily with 2 other companions. The tavern owner stated that the man was boasting to the room that he had found a definitive way to punish the circus management for humiliating him, and that he had recently purchased several large metal containers from a nearby fuel depot along the water. The detectives raced to the fuel depot and demanded to see the sales ledgers for the previous 48 hours, flipping through the pages until they found a cash purchase for several liters of highly volatile commercial gasoline. The clerk who managed the counter vividly remembered the transaction because the buyer had been loud, aggressive, and smelled of cheap alcohol. The name written on the hazardous materials logbook matched a local record, revealing that the primary suspect behind the entire operation was a 28-year-old local laborer named Adilson Marcelino Alves. Carlos and a dozen armed officers tracked Alves down to an abandoned railway warehouse on the outskirts of the city, taking him and his 2 accomplices into custody without a fight. Under intense interrogation at the precinct, Alves initially maintained his innocence, but his 2 companions quickly broke down under the pressure, admitting that they had been paid with stolen goods to help Alves carry out a coordinated plan of deliberate arson against the circus. Based on the detailed confessions of the accomplices, the sales ledgers from the harbor fuel depot, and the chemical analysis of the support cable remnants, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened on the afternoon of December 17th, 1961. Early that afternoon, the man and his 2 companions walked quietly along the dusty perimeter fence behind the circus lot, carrying 3 heavy metal cans concealed inside coarse burlap sacks. They stood in the shadows of a nearby warehouse, watching as the final rush of families pushed through the main gates, listening to the muffled sounds of the brass band echoing from inside the main tent structure. The man felt a deep wave of resentment as he stared at the red and white nylon stripes, his jaw tightening as he replayed the manager's insults in his mind. He waited until the ticket lines cleared and the security guards moved toward the front entrance before nodding to his companions and slipping through a loose panel in the wooden boundary fence. They crept across the dry grass toward the rear of the main arena, stopping directly beneath the heavy support columns where the main roof fabric was secured to massive iron stakes driven into the dirt. They uncapped the metal containers, tilted them forward, and began dousing the thick hemp ropes and the lower edges of the nylon walls with liters of raw gasoline. The fuel soaked deeply into the absorbent fibers, creating a highly volatile chemical trail that led straight up toward the wax-coated ceiling. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a box of wooden matches, and scraped one against the striking strip, creating a bright flare of yellow light. He dropped the burning match directly onto the saturated base of the support rope, watching as a wall of blue flame ignited with a low whistle and raced up the side of the tent. The 3 figures then turned and ran into the crowded city streets, disappearing into the civilian traffic before the first alarms could sound. In the months following the tragedy, Adilson Marcelino Alves and his 2 accomplices stood trial before a panel of judges in Rio de Janeiro, facing charges of mass arson and multiple counts of first-degree murder. The presentation of the fuel depot ledgers and the confessions made a defense impossible, and all 3 men were convicted of their crimes. Alves was sentenced to a maximum term of 16 years in a secure prison facility, with an additional 10 years of mandatory confinement inside a state psychiatric ward where he remained until his life eventually ended behind closed doors. The disaster resulted in an absolute overhaul of safety regulations for public entertainment across South America, leading to a permanent ban on the use of flammable wax coatings on temporary commercial structures. Long after the trials concluded, and the lot was cleared of the charred iron poles, the empty dirt field remained vacant for years, a dark patch of earth where the grass refused to grow. The silence that settled over the lot stood as a quiet reminder of how a single act of petty spite can completely destroy hundreds of innocent families in a matter of minutes. And yet human malice often operates with far more calculated patience, choosing to hide behind a mask of total affection while systematically bringing a silent destruction into the most comfortable and trusted spaces of a home. On a May afternoon in 1963, 16-year-old high school student Yoshia Nakata walked out of her school gates in Sayama, Japan. The sun was kind of ducking behind some low gray clouds, and a cool breeze was rustling the leaves of the nearby barley fields. Yoshie was in a hurry because today was her 16th birthday, and her family was planning a small dinner at home to celebrate. She adjusted the strap of her school bag, waved goodbye to her classmates at the intersection, and turned down the narrow dirt path that cut straight through the local farms. Now the path she took was completely familiar, a route she walked every single day. Along the borders of the path, local farmers were busy tending to their crops, some of them digging up the rich, dark soil, while others loaded wooden crates onto the backs of small, flatbed trucks. It was the type of close community where everyone kind of looked out for one another. Children often ran down these same lanes playing tag, and neighbors would exchange quick greetings across the low stone walls without even stopping their work. But as the clock neared 5 in the evening, Yoshi still had not walked through the front door of her family home. Her older brother Isaku was sitting at the low kitchen table looking at the clock on the wall. It was completely unlike his sister to be late, especially on her birthday. Usually, she would run into the house by 4:30, dropping her books on the floor, and immediately asking what was for dinner. Isaku stood out on the front porch, looking down the empty dirt road, but there was only the sound of a distant tractor engine. So, as the shadows began to stretch across the yard, a growing sense of anxiety settled over the household. Isaku decided to walk down the path toward the school, thinking his sister might have just stopped to chat with a friend, or got delayed by a school project. He walked past the barley fields, asking a couple of the farmers if they had seen Yoshi passing by earlier. But every single person he spoke to just shook their head, saying the lane had been completely quiet since the school bells rang. By 7 in the evening, the sky had turned a deep bruised purple. Isaku hurried back to the house where his parents were already on the phone with other relatives and neighbors trying to find any trace of the girl. And right as Isaku walked into the entryway, he noticed something strange resting on the small wooden ledge near the front door. It was a white paper envelope that had definitely not been there when he left. He picked it up and saw some rough, uneven characters scrawled across the front in dark ink. Isaku tore open the envelope, and as his eyes scanned the page, inside his whole body went completely rigid. It was a ransom note. The message was short, demanding that the family bring several 100,000 yen to a specific location near the local post office late the following night. The writer made it explicitly clear that if the family contacted the authorities, or if anyone followed the drop-off instructions incorrectly, Yoshi would never be seen alive again. Despite the severe warnings in the note, the family knew they could not handle this situation on their own. They contacted the Sayama Police Department immediately. Within an hour, a team of plainclothes detectives slipped into the Nakata home through the back door to avoid drawing any attention from the neighbors. The lead investigator looked over the ransom note, examining the precise wording and the erratic handwriting. He assured the family that they would set up a massive sting operation to trap the kidnapper at the money drop. The police plan was highly tactical. They prepared a package of decoy money, filling a leather pouch with regular sheets of paper, cut to the exact size of yen notes, placing just a few real bills on the very top. 40 plainclothes officers were deployed all around the drop-off location, hiding behind bushes, blending into the shadows of the storefronts, and staying completely silent. Isaku was instructed to carry the pouch to the designated spot and wait for the perpetrator to make contact. It was just past midnight on May 3rd when Isaku stood under the dim light of a single street lamp near the post office. The air was incredibly crisp and his breath formed small white plumes in the dark. He gripped the leather pouch tightly, his heart slamming against his ribs. For over an hour, there was absolutely no movement. But then a low, muffled footstep sounded from the narrow alleyway directly behind him. a dark figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light. The figure spoke in a low voice, demanding that Isaku hand over the money immediately. Isaku took a step forward, trying to get a clear look at the man's face, but the stranger had a cap pulled down low over his eyes. Just as Isaku extended his arm to hand over the package, several police officers, overwhelmed by the tension, broke cover. Their heavy boots crunched loudly on the gravel as they rushed forward, shouting for the suspect to freeze. Now, the moment the perpetrator heard those shouts, he realized it was a trap. He turned on his heel and bolted back into the pitch-black alleyway. The detectives swarmed the lane, flashing their lights into the dark corners. But the alley connected to a complex web of narrow paths and dense agricultural fields. Despite having 40 trained officers completely surrounding the area, the police had totally botched the operation. The suspect slipped right through their perimeter and vanished into the night. So the following morning, news of the failed sting operation leaked to the public, and an absolute wave of outrage swept through the entire country. The media heavily criticized the Sayama Police Department, calling them incompetent and lazy. The public pressure on the investigators became entirely unbearable, with high-ranking officials demanding an immediate arrest to restore the department's reputation. The detectives knew that if they did not find a suspect soon, their entire careers would be ruined. 2 days later, on May 5th, the situation turned from a high-stakes kidnapping into an absolute tragedy. A local farmer was clearing some brush near the edge of a large farm about a mile away from the Nakata home when his shovel hit something solid in the dirt. He cleared away the loose soil and discovered a shallow grave. Inside was the lifeless body of Yoshie Nakata. Her hands had been bound behind her back, and a medical examiner later confirmed she had been strangled to death within hours of her disappearance. The discovery of the body intensified the public fury to an extreme degree. People were demanding justice, and the police department was completely desperate. They needed a culprit, and they needed one immediately. So, instead of methodically following the physical evidence or tracking the ransom note's paper trail, the authorities decided to look closely at a specific group of people living on the margins of Sayama society. They targeted the Burakumin community. Now the Burakumin were a historically marginalized social group in Japan, victims of deep systemic discrimination for centuries. They often lived in isolated low-income neighborhoods and worked the lowest-paying manual labor jobs. The police knew that the public would easily accept a culprit from this community because of pre-existing biases. They began raiding the local Burakumin neighborhood, detaining young men without any warrants and looking for anyone they could easily pin the crime on. On May 23rd, detectives knocked on the door of a modest home and arrested 24-year-old Kazuo Ishikawa. Kazuo was a young man from the Burakumin community who worked as a casual farm laborer. He had absolutely no history of violence, and his friends knew him as a quiet, hard-working guy who mostly kept to himself. But the police did not care about his reputation. They locked him in an interrogation room at the precinct, completely cutting him off from the outside world. Kazuo immediately told the investigators that he had absolutely nothing to do with the kidnapping or the murder. He explained that he had a rock-solid alibi for the night Yoshie disappeared, as he had been working late on a farm with several co-workers who could easily verify his location. But the detectives simply brushed his alibi aside, refusing to contact his employer or check his time logs. They were completely focused on breaking him down until he gave them exactly what they wanted. For several weeks, Kazuo was subjected to prolonged, intense interrogation sessions that lasted up to 16 hours a day. The detectives deprived him of sleep, screamed at him constantly, and threatened to arrest his entire family if he did not cooperate. Kazuo, like many people in his community at the time, was completely illiterate. He could not read or write a single character of the Japanese language. So when the police placed a thick handwritten document in front of him, he had absolutely no idea what it said. The detectives told Kazuo that if he just signed the paper, the entire ordeal would be over, and he would be allowed to go home to his parents. Exhausted, disoriented, and completely worried for his family's safety, Kazuo finally relented. He dipped his thumb in red ink and pressed his print onto the bottom of the page. He thought he was signing a release form, but in reality, he had just signed a detailed confession admitting to the kidnap and murder of Yoshie Nakata. Based on Tokyo High Court records and historical appeal filings, here is a reconstruction of what the police believe happened to Yoshie Nakata on the afternoon of May 1st, 1963. The killer was hiding in the thick brush along the edge of the narrow dirt path, watching the high school students walk home in small groups. He stayed completely still, his eyes scanning the lane until he spotted a lone figure walking down the path toward the farms. It was Yoshi. She was holding her school bag, looking down at the dirt road, completely unaware that anyone was watching her from the trees. The killer waited until the other students had disappeared around the corner before stepping out. He stepped directly into her path, blocking her way. Yoshi stopped her eyes wide as she looked at the stranger. Before she could scream or run back toward the main road, the man lunged forward, grabbing her arms and dragging her into the dense barley fields. He forced her down into the dirt, tying her hands behind her back with a rough length of hemp rope. He told her to stay completely quiet, promising that if her family paid the money, she would be allowed to go home safely. Later that night, the killer sat at a small wooden table under a single dim bulb, writing the ransom note. He took a sheet of regular white paper and carefully scrawled out the text, his hand shaking slightly as he demanded the several 100,000 yen. He knew the Nakata family well enough to know their address, and he walked through the dark streets of Sayama to drop the envelope onto the ledge by their front door, before vanishing back into the shadows of the agricultural lanes. And then, after the police completely botched the sting operation at the post office, the killer panicked. He realized the authorities were heavily involved and that a massive manhunt was about to begin. He went back to the isolated location where he was holding Yoshie hostage. Realizing that he could not let her live to identify him to the detectives, he strangled her to death, carried her body to a nearby farm in the dead of night, and buried her in a shallow grave before escaping completely. But the physical evidence in the case did not support the police narrative at all. When forensic experts finally examined the original ransom note, they noted that the handwriting was highly sophisticated, written by someone with a very advanced level of education and literacy. Kazuo Ishikawa, being completely illiterate, could not have physically written a single word of that note. Furthermore, none of the footprints or physical marks found at the muddy gravesite matched Kazuo's boots or clothing. Despite the blatant lack of physical evidence and the clear discrepancies in the handwriting, Kazuo Ishikawa was put on trial in late 1963. The coerced confession was the primary piece of evidence used by the prosecution. In a courtroom filled with public hostility, Kazuo was found guilty and sentenced to death. He spent years on death row consistently claiming his innocence to anyone who would listen, while a team of dedicated human rights lawyers began fighting to overturn the verdict. In 1974, his death sentence was eventually commuted to life in prison, but it took decades of constant legal battles for the truth about the police corruption to finally surface. Kazuo spent a total of 31 years behind bars for a crime he did not commit, completely isolated from his youth and his community. He was finally released on parole in 1994, but to this very day, his legal team is still fighting for a full official acquittal from the Tokyo High Court. The Sayama incident remains one of Japan's most notorious examples of wrongful conviction and systemic discrimination, with the real killer never being identified by the authorities. Kazuo Ishikawa, now an elderly man, still attends public rallies, holding up his hands and demanding that the government officially clear his name before he passes away. He was a victim of an institutional system that chose to protect its own reputation by framing an innocent farm laborer, leaving a teenage girl's true killer completely free to walk away. And while Kazuo was trapped inside a concrete cell for decades, dreaming of a freedom he had been completely stripped of, some people find themselves trapped in a completely different kind of isolation. An isolation surrounded not by walls, but by a vast, unforgiving ocean, where the rules of normal society completely vanish and survival depends entirely on the strength of a bond between a group of teenagers who have absolutely nowhere else to go. On a clear afternoon in September of 1966, an Australian businessman and experienced sea captain named Peter Warner was piloting his fishing boat, the Just David, through the remote waters of the South Pacific. Peter was a man who loved the open water, you know. He was the son of a massive electronic tycoon back in Australia, but he had chosen to spend his time establishing a fleet of commercial fishing vessels around the island kingdom of Tonga. On this particular day, the sea was relatively calm, and Peter was checking his maps as they cruised past a tiny, isolated landmass known as Ada Island. Now, Ada was a completely dead spot on the map, a place where nobody had set foot for more than 90 years. Back in the early 1860s, Peruvian slave traders had raided the tiny island, kidnapping the entire population and carrying them away into forced labor, which led the King of Tonga to declare the island a forbidden zone. It was basically just a massive, jagged piece of volcanic rock covered in dense green jungle with vertical cliffs dropping hundreds of feet straight into the deep ocean currents. As Peter was standing on the bridge of his boat, idly scanning the high green canopy of the island through his binoculars, he noticed something completely out of place. There was a faint, thin column of dark gray smoke rising from a clearing near the highest ridge of the volcanic crater. He lowered the lenses, rubbed his eyes, and looked again, thinking it might just be a pocket of mist or a volcanic vent, but the line of smoke was steady and intentional. Out of sheer curiosity, Peter instructed his crew to turn the wheel and bring the vessel closer to the jagged shoreline. And as the boat got within a few hundred yards of the crashing surf, he raised his binoculars again and saw multiple figures running frantically down the sheer rock faces of the cliff. They were completely naked, their hair reached all the way down to their waists, and they were waving their arms and shouting at the top of their lungs. Before Peter could even ask his crew what was happening, these figures dove straight off the rocks into the boiling white surf and began swimming directly toward his boat. Now, Peter was completely taken aback by this, and he immediately ordered his crew to head down to the cabin and grab their rifles. You have to remember, this was a completely lawless and isolated part of the open ocean, and they had absolutely no idea who these people were. They could have been escaped prisoners, marooned mutineers, or individuals who had gone completely wild on this forbidden rock. The first figure reached the side of the boat, his hands catching the low metal railing with an iron grip. He pulled his torso up onto the deck, breathing heavily. And before any of the crew could raise a weapon, the young man looked right at Peter and spoke in perfect English. He said, "My name is Sione. There are 6 of us here. We think we have been stranded on this rock for over a year." Peter just stood there on the deck, staring at the kid with his mouth open. He told his men to step back and lower their rifles, helping the other 5 naked teenagers pull themselves up over the wooden gunwale. Despite living on an abandoned volcanic rock for 15 months, the boys were in remarkably good shape, their muscles lean and their skin deeply bronzed by the sun. Peter hurried into his radio room and contacted the maritime operator in Nuku'alofa, the capital city of Tonga, which was located about 100 miles away. He got the operator on the line and explained that he had just rescued 6 boys on Atta Island who claimed their names were Sion, Stephen Kolo, David, Luke, and Mano. The moment Peter finished listing the names, the radio line went completely dead. For several seconds, there was only the sound of static. Then Peter heard the operator on the other end break down into tears, sobbing so hard he could barely speak into the microphone. The operator finally gasped and said, "You found them. We held their traditional funerals over a year ago. The entire country believes those boys drowned at sea." Based on the official logs of the Just David Australian Maritime Records from 1966 and the comprehensive personal journals of the survivors themselves, here is a reconstruction of how 6 ordinary schoolboys managed to survive an impossible situation. The journey actually began 15 months earlier in June of 1965 in the capital city of Nuku'alofa. These 6 teenagers, Sione Fatawa, Stephen Fetalai, Kolo Fekitoa, David Karaman, Luke Vekoso, and Mano Totau were all close friends attending a very strict Catholic boarding school called St. Andrew's College. The school was run with absolute military-style rigidity. The days were entirely packed with mandatory study hours, strict chores, and religious services that began way before dawn. The boys felt completely suffocated by the endless rules and the heavy discipline, and they were just regular teenagers who wanted some freedom and adventure. They started holding these secret midnight meetings in their dormitory, whispering in the dark about escaping to Fiji, or maybe even trying to sail all the way to New Zealand to see the world. The main problem was that they did not have a boat and they had absolutely no money to rent one, so they decided they would just borrow a vessel from the local wharf. They targeted a 24-foot wooden fishing boat belonging to a local fisherman named Taniela Uhila, a man who was notorious around the docks for his bad temper and his absolute protective nature over his equipment. The boys did not intend to keep the vessel permanently. They honestly thought they would just take it for a quick trip and figure out a way to return it later. They were incredibly naive. They did not pack a single map, they did not have a compass, and none of them had any training in deep-sea navigation. The only supplies they brought were 2 large sacks of bananas, a few coconuts, and a small portable gas burner. On a dark night in June, they snuck out of the school gates, slipped down to the harbor, untied the heavy lines of the fishing boat, and let the ocean currents carry them out past the reef, into the open waters of the Pacific. They hoisted the canvas sail, and because they were completely exhausted from the stress of the escape, they all decided to lie down on the deck and go to sleep, assuming they would just drift toward their destination. But in the middle of the night, a massive tropical storm completely blindsided them. The wind began howling across the water, creating massive waves that crashed over the sides of the wooden hull, filling the small cabin with freezing salt water. Before the boys could even figure out how to lower the sail, a violent gust of wind caught the canvas, and there was a loud cracking sound as the thick wooden mast snapped entirely in 2. The sail tore away into the dark, and seconds later, a massive wave ripped the rudder right off the back of the boat. They were left with absolutely no steering, no sail, and no way to control their movement, just drifting helplessly in the middle of a vast, empty ocean. For 8 long days, the teenagers were completely at the mercy of the deep ocean currents. Their small supply of bananas and coconuts was gone by the second afternoon, and their portable gas burner had washed overboard during the storm. The sun was completely brutal, burning their bare skin until it began to blister, and the constant friction of the salt water created deep, painful sores on their legs and arms. They were suffering from severe dehydration, and their tongues became so swollen they could barely whisper to one another. They tried to collect tiny drops of morning dew by scraping the condensation off the wooden deck with their fingernails, and they used hollowed-out pieces of debris to catch a few drops of water during a brief rain shower. But it was barely enough to keep them alive. By the 7th evening, they were so weak, they were just lying flat on their backs in the bottom of the leaking hull, waiting to die. But on the morning of the 8th day, they heard the distant thunderous sound of crashing waves. Kolo dragged himself up to look over the gunwale and saw a massive dark shape rising out of the water. It was Ada Island. The ocean currents were pushing the broken remains of their vessel directly toward a jagged coral reef that lined the base of the island's massive volcanic cliffs. The boat struck the reef with a violent impact, the wooden planks shattering into pieces all at once. The boys were thrown into the churning white water, but the sudden shock gave them a burst of strength. They swam through the waves, dodging the sharp coral, and managed to drag themselves onto a narrow strip of rocky shore at the bottom of a 500-foot cliff. They were alive, but they were completely trapped on a narrow, barren beach with no food, no fresh water, and no visible way to climb the vertical rock wall above them. For the first few days, they survived by eating raw seabirds, sucking the moisture out of wild ice plants that grew in the rock crevices, and drinking the blood of small lizards they caught on the stones. They knew they could not stay on the narrow beach forever, so they began searching the cliff face for any sort of handhold. Working together, pushing and pulling each other up the vertical rock, they managed to scale the 500-foot cliff and reach the top, entering an ancient volcanic crater at the center of the island. And once they were inside, the entire environment changed. They discovered an abandoned village that had been empty since the 19th century, and they found wild taro roots, wild papayas, and a flock of feral chickens that had been breeding on the island for generations. They had food, but they knew that if they wanted to survive for the long term, they could not let themselves descend into chaos. Instead of turning on each other, the 6 boys made a solemn pact to work together as a highly structured mini-society. They divided themselves into pairs and created a strict daily roster for chores. One pair was in charge of the camp kitchen, preparing the wild taro and papaya. Another pair was responsible for security and maintaining their shelters, which they built out of thick branches and thatched leaves. But the most important job on the entire island belonged to the third pair, who were in charge of guarding the fire. They had managed to start a single small fire by rubbing 2 sticks together for hours, until a spark caught a pile of dry coconut husks. They knew that if that fire ever went out, they might never be able to start it again, so they set up a 24-hour watch rotation, ensuring that someone was always sitting by the flames, even in the middle of the night during tropical rainstorms. They kept that exact same fire burning continuously for more than a year. Living in such close quarters under extreme stress meant that arguments were bound to happen, you know. They were teenagers, and sometimes the pressure would get to them. But they came up with a very specific rule to handle conflicts before they turned dangerous. If 2 boys started shouting or got into a disagreement, they were ordered to immediately walk away from the camp and go to opposite sides of the island to sit completely alone for 4 hours to cool down. If they came back to the camp and were still furious with each other, they would step into a makeshift boxing ring they had cleared in the dirt. They would put on thick wraps made of cloth and branches, and they would openly fight it out under the strict supervision of the other 4 boys until the argument was settled. The moment the fight was over, the anger was completely gone. They would shake hands, sit down together, and Kolo would pull out a primitive guitar he had constructed out of a piece of driftwood, half a coconut shell, and 6 steel wires he had salvaged from the broken boat wreck, and they would sing songs and say their daily Catholic prayers together. Back in Tonga, their families had given up hope months ago. Weeks after the boys disappeared, local search parties had found some pieces of the broken fishing boat drifting near the reefs, and the authorities concluded that the teenagers had simply drowned in the open ocean. The community held traditional Tongan funerals, and their mothers and fathers put away their photos, mourning them as dead. Meanwhile, on the island, the boys kept working. One day, Stephen was exploring a high ridge when he slipped and fell over 30 feet down a rocky slope, snapping his leg bone completely in two. The other boys rushed down the cliff, carried him back to the shelter, and carefully set the bone using straight branches and tough vines as a splint. They told him not to worry about a thing, and they took over his daily roster chores for months, nursing him back to health until his leg healed perfectly straight. When Captain Peter Warner finally spotted their smoke signal in September of 1966 and brought them back to the harbor in Nuku'alofa, the entire city erupted into an absolute frenzy of joy. Thousands of people lined the docks, crying and shouting as the 6 boys stepped off the boat, looking like completely different people with their long hair and heavily calloused skin. But the celebration was cut incredibly short. The moment the boys stepped onto the concrete wharf, a team of local police officers moved in, clicked handcuffs onto their wrists, and marched them straight to a secure cell at the precinct. The owner of the fishing boat, Tanyela Uhila, was still completely furious about his stolen property, and he had refused to drop the grand theft charges against them, meaning the boys were facing years in a high-security prison facility right after surviving 15 months on a volcanic rock. Peter Warner was absolutely disgusted by this treatment, and he knew he had to intervene. He went straight to the fisherman's house and offered to pay him £150 out of his own pocket to fully compensate him for the loss of the old boat, which was far more than the vessel was actually worth. The fisherman accepted the cash and dropped the charges, and the boys were immediately released from jail to their families. Peter was so impressed by their survival skills, their discipline, and their work ethic that he actually managed to sell the international movie and print rights to their story for a substantial sum of money, using the funds to buy a brand new commercial fishing trawler. He hired all 6 boys as his official full-time crew, giving them the legitimate maritime careers they had always dreamed of. In late 1966, the boys began their first official voyage as a professional crew, traveling across the very same waters where they had nearly lost their lives. Sione, Stephen Colo, David, Luke, and Mano remained close friends for the rest of their lives, with several of them eventually relocating to Australia to raise families of their own. They proved that even when young people are completely stripped of civilization, they do not have to turn on one another to survive. They showed that simple discipline, mutual respect, and a shared commitment to keeping a single fire burning can hold a small community together, even in the middle of a vast and completely empty ocean. It was a frigid December day in a small logging town in Maine, roughly an hour's drive from the United States-Canadian border. And despite the falling snow, Christmas shoppers were out in full force, bundling up against the bitter wind. But a small crowd had gathered right in front of the local police station, watching an officer staple a poster to a telephone pole. When he stepped aside, everyone shuffled closer to see a forensic sketch of a middle-aged woman with a narrow face, thin nose, glasses, and bangs. According to the text, police were looking for her in connection with a recent double homicide. Now, the shoppers were completely caught up in their conversation, discussing whether the sketch looked like anyone they knew in the county. They were so distracted that they did not notice a bundled-up figure hurrying past them on the sidewalk. This figure slowed down just long enough to glance at the poster, recognizing the face in the sketch, which bore a striking resemblance to their own face. Then, before anyone could look up or notice them, the figure turned and quickly hurried off into the falling snow, disappearing down a side street. So, to understand how this sketch ended up on a telephone pole, we have to go back to the evening of November 27, 2009. A 47-year-old man named Michael Miller, though everyone in the area just called him Big Mike, was walking around his property in Webster Plantation, Maine. Like his nickname suggested, Big Mike was a huge man with a big bushy beard, and he looked completely at home in this desolate rural setting. He was studying his double-wide trailer, thinking through the new addition he was planning to build. But his hometown of Webster Plantation was not really a town at all, you know. It had a permanent population of only 85 people, a one-room town hall, 2 roads, and absolutely no streetlights to illuminate the dark corners at night. There had never really been much to do there, aside from creek fishing, taking in the nature, and working at the local lumber mill. Big Mike had been a seasonal employee at that mill for 29 years. But just 1 week ago, the management had abruptly laid him off due to budget cuts. And the loss of his job had stung, but Mike was not too worried about the immediate future. He and his wife Valerie, who everyone called Val, lived very frugally, so they had enough cash stowed away in their home to get by until he found another position. Big Mike was just about to head back inside his trailer when he heard a vehicle approaching through the trees. A familiar white Ford Explorer pulled up to his mobile home and outstepped his two adult sons, 27-year-old Mike Jr. and 26-year-old Matt. Now, Mike Jr., the oldest son, was basically a smaller, clean-shaven version of Big Mike, but his younger brother Matt was a lot different, you know. He was skinny and pale with a short buzz cut and distinct black tattoos winding along his neck. Matt also had heavy shadows hanging under his eyes, kind of like he had not been sleeping well for weeks. Big Mike had not expected to see his kids tonight, but he was always happy for a visit, so he walked up and gave them both a big hug. And then Mike called out to Val that the boys had stopped by, and within seconds his wife appeared from the kitchen with a tin of her famous homemade coffee cakes. At 47 years old, Val was a very energetic and petite woman who looked even smaller, standing next to her hulking husband. The family snacked and caught up on news, and then Val reminded everyone that they had a big celebration tomorrow. Matt's baby daughter was turning 1 year old, marking her very first birthday. But Matt still had not told anyone what the official party plans were, which Val immediately insisted was completely ridiculous. Matt shrugged and said they weren't really planning on doing anything special, but Val refused to take no for an answer. She told him that if he did not want to plan a party, she and Big Mike would be more than happy to host the entire thing at their trailer. Matt tried to dissuade her, but he finally caved and agreed to let her host it as long as it stayed small. So they agreed the guest list would just be immediate family, along with Mike Jr. and his lifelong best friend Nate Nightingale, who was practically family anyway. Then Matt excused himself and asked if Big Mike could step outside with him into the snow for a moment. Mike's jaw instantly tensed because he could guess exactly where this conversation was heading. And sure enough, the moment they were outside together, Matt looked at his father and asked if he could borrow a significant amount of money. And Matt began talking quickly, explaining how he had not worked in months and was completely struggling with all the basic costs of a new baby. He claimed he could not even afford gifts or a birthday cake for tomorrow's party. When he finally finished his speech, Big Mike told Matt not to worry about the cake because he and Val would gladly pick one up before the party started. But Mike firmly told his younger son that he could not lend him any cash at the moment. But Big Mike explained that he had just been laid off from his own job at the mill, so money was tight for everyone. And more importantly, he openly admitted that he could not trust that Matt would actually use the money for his family. Matt looked absolutely furious at his father's response, his eyes narrowing in the dark, but he did not push the issue any further. He just shook his head, turned around, and walked back inside the mobile home, where he asked Mike Jr. if he was ready to leave. The boys left a few minutes later, giving Val a quick kiss on the cheek before climbing into Matt's white Ford Explorer and backing down the driveway. Big Mike stood on the porch and watched the SUV's taillights disappear into the dense forest, wondering if he had been too hard on his son. Then, he heard Val calling him from inside, and he turned around to close the door and head back into the kitchen, completely pushing the bad interaction out of his mind. Around 12:40 p.m. the next day, which was Saturday, November 28th, another car pulled up outside of the mobile home. The driver climbed out, grabbed a red plastic gas can from the back seat, and started trudging through the fresh snow toward the trailer door. The driver's name was Alan Richardson, and he was a close neighbor and longtime friend of Big Mike and Val. Alan had borrowed the gas can a few days earlier, and he was just stopping by to return it. However, when Alan reached the front door and knocked loudly, no one responded from inside. He tried the door handle and was surprised to find it was locked, which was unusual because people in this remote area typically left their doors unlocked during the day. Alan looked around the clearing and saw that both of the Millers' vehicles were parked right nearby, so he assumed they must be inside. He tried knocking again, harder this time, but the trailer remained completely silent. Now Alan moved over to the nearest kitchen window, cupped his hands around his eyes, and peered through the glass to see what was going on. He was able to make out homemade birthday decorations taped to one wall, along with paper plates and a few liters of soda sitting out on the counter. It looked like Big Mike and Val were right in the middle of getting ready for the party. But just then, Alan noticed something disturbing on the kitchen floor right below the counter. And it took his eyes a moment to realize what he was even looking at through the glass, but once he did, he nearly fell over backward in shock. Big Mike and Val were both sprawled flat on the floor beside each other, completely motionless. Alan rapped his knuckles furiously against the glass and screamed their names, but neither of them moved at all. His hands were shaking violently as he pulled out his cell phone and punched in 911 to call for help. The dispatcher picked up, and Alan explained that he had just discovered the Millers unconscious on their kitchen floor with the door locked. He asked if he should break the window and try to help them, but the dispatcher strictly instructed him to stay outside. The dispatcher explained that whatever had caused them to collapse, like a carbon monoxide leak or an electrical issue, could still be in the air, so Alan had to wait until emergency personnel arrived on the scene. But because Webster Plantation is located so far from civilization, it took a long time for the first responders to arrive from the nearest station over 30 miles away. Alan was waiting nervously in the driveway when he finally heard sirens echoing through the woods. An ambulance rounded the bend, followed by a police cruiser and a fire engine. A police officer wearing a full respirator mask told Alan to stand aside while the firefighters tested the air for gas. When the firefighters announced that the air was completely clear, the police forced the side door open and entered the mobile home. What they found in the kitchen was Big Mike lying flat on his back, his legs folded awkwardly beneath his heavy frame. Val was slumped right by his side, her head resting gently on his chest. Their skin was entirely waxy and pale, and they were not breathing. There was a small amount of dark blood pooling on the floor around them. And as soon as the EMTs looked closer at the bodies, it became clear that this was not a gas leak or a medical emergency. They noticed a small hole in Val's right temple, and an identical one at the base of Big Mike's skull. The Millers had been shot. Meanwhile, Alan continued to wait outside in the snow, watching the chaotic activity from a distance. Within 30 minutes, lead investigators Darrell Perry and Brian Stout of the Maine State Police arrived to take over. Detective Perry's first thought upon entering the mobile home was just how neat and tidy everything was. He had half expected a cluttered mess, but instead, he found a clean living room full of family photos and birthday decorations. The detectives moved into the kitchen where the medical examiner was crouching over the victims. Detective Stout leaned down to examine the wounds, noting that the weapon had to be a small, underpowered handgun, most likely a .22 caliber pistol. The detectives perked up when they heard this because a small gun, like a .22 pistol, would typically be used at very close range. And if Big Mike was shot from behind, it suggested that he knew his killer and trusted them well enough to invite them into his kitchen and turn his back on them. Just as they were discussing this, a police officer called them into a small back room that was completely full of tall wooden shelves. And when Stout and Perry walked inside, they found the room was stocked, floor to ceiling, with used electronics, stacks of DVDs, tools, and a large collection of firearms. They began pulling out random bins, trying to figure out what all this merchandise was doing here. It turned out that to supplement his income, Big Mike operated an unlicensed pawn shop and a loan shark business right out of his trailer, and he also bought and sold prescription narcotics. This information completely cast the murders in a whole new light for the state troopers. Big Mike was running a shady, illegal business that turned his home into a revolving door for desperate, low-income individuals. And they figured Mike must have kept large amounts of cash on hand to run his operations, making him a prime target for a robbery. Just then, there was a loud commotion outside the trailer, and the detectives went to the window to look. A young man in his late 20s was flailing his arms in frustration, while a deputy blocked him from entering the door. The man kept screaming that he needed to see his mother and father until the deputy gently said, "I'm sorry, Mike, they're gone." At that point, the young man just collapsed into tears. The detectives walked out to meet him, and he introduced himself as Mike Jr., the oldest son. He had rushed over after hearing rumors about an accident. Mike Jr. explained that he had spent the last few minutes desperately trying to call his younger brother Matt to break the news, but Matt was not picking up his phone. The detectives asked Mike Jr. if he knew anyone who would want to harm his parents. He gave the standard response that everyone loved them, but then a worried look came across his face. He openly admitted to the detectives that his father ran the illegal loan business out of the back room. So Detective Perry went back inside the trailer to check the records while Stout called headquarters to run a background check on names. Flipping through Big Mike's meticulous financial logs, Perry discovered that a heavy metal safe where Mike stored high-value jewelry and cash was entirely missing from the shelf. He also noticed that one specific ledger book, the one used to track outstanding loans and names of debtors, had been completely ripped out of the stack. This cemented the theory that robbery was the primary motive. When Stout came back inside, he told Perry that Mike Jr. had mentioned speaking to his mother at 10 a.m. that morning, and he had heard their cousin Clayton Giddon talking in the background. Clayton lived in the nearby town of Springfield, and records showed he was an avid hunter who owned multiple firearms. The detectives decided to drive over to Springfield immediately to pay him a visit. When they knocked on Clayton's door, the man answered and looked completely terrified, as though he had already heard rumors about his relatives. When they told him it was a double homicide, Clayton became incredibly distraught. He explained that he had driven over with his 9-year-old daughter to have coffee with his aunt and uncle at 10 a.m. He insisted everything was fine and they were happy about the upcoming birthday party. But then Clayton gave the detectives a massive piece of new information. He said that when he and his daughter arrived, they were not alone with the Millers. Mike Jr.'s best friend, a young man named Nate Nightingale, was already sitting at the kitchen table. And when Clayton and his daughter left the trailer at 10:30 a.m., Nate Nightingale was still inside the kitchen with Big Mike and Val. Now, the investigators pulled Big Mike's official phone records and discovered that he had called a friend at 10:40 a.m., and that friend confirmed Mike sounded completely normal. This narrowed the timeline down to a strict 2-hour window. The couple was alive at 10:40 a.m., but they were dead by 12:44 p.m. when the neighbor called 911. The detectives set out to locate both Nate Nightingale and the younger son, Matt Miller. They drove to Matt's apartment first, and the moment he opened the door, both detectives could sense that something was wrong. The 26-year-old had deep shadows under his eyes and appeared incredibly nervous and evasive. He did not show any signs of grief, and he did not press the detectives for any details about the investigation. Instead, he just kept shifting his weight and looking at the floor, claiming he had spent the morning driving around Lincoln with his girlfriend Tanya. Matt claimed they were picking up last-minute items for his daughter's birthday party. His story was incredibly short on details, and because Tanya was out running errands with the baby, she could not confirm his whereabouts. The detectives left the apartment highly suspicious, and they quietly began contacting local residents in the area to ask about Matt. They quickly learned that Matt was heavily addicted to prescription drugs and had been pawning his own belongings to buy more. And then, a local resident dropped a massive tip, explaining that they had seen Matt's white Ford Explorer parked near his parents' road on the morning of the murders. Even worse, another witness called the station to report that on the evening before the shootings, Matt had called him up looking to buy a .22 caliber pistol. This was the exact type of weapon used to kill the Millers. At this point, the detectives knew they had to bring Matt in. On December 3rd, 5 days after the murders, they arrested Matt on an outstanding warrant for bouncing checks and took him to an interrogation room. They pushed him hard for hours, accusing him of murdering his parents for money. Matt became incredibly emotional, weeping openly, but he fiercely maintained his innocence. Finally, he broke down and confessed to a different secret, admitting that his entire alibi about driving around Lincoln was a total lie. Matt sobbed and explained that on the morning of the murders, he had actually driven out to the woods to meet an illegal drug dealer. He bought a batch of prescription pills, walked into the forest, and spent 2 hours getting high by himself. He said he lied because he was completely ashamed that he was off using drugs instead of getting ready for his daughter's first birthday party. The detectives were skeptical, so they decided to verify his story by checking security cameras. Stout and Perry spent the next 2 days meticulously scrubbing through hours of closed-circuit security camera footage from businesses along the main highway near the Millers' property. They were looking for any sign of Matt's white Ford Explorer. But as they were watching the monitor, Perry suddenly grabbed Stout's shoulder and pointed at the screen. A camera had captured a vehicle traveling away from the mobile home at 11:25 a.m. on the morning of the murders. But the vehicle on the screen was not a white Ford Explorer at all. It was a small sedan belonging to Nate Nightingale. Before the detectives could even process this new evidence or draw up an arrest warrant, Perry's desk phone rang. A woman was on the line crying uncontrollably. She told the detective that she was Nate Nightingale's girlfriend, and that Nate had just broken down and confessed to her that he was the one who shot Big Mike and Val. Nate Nightingale was arrested on December 12th, and the moment he was placed in the interrogation room, his cooperative persona completely vanished. He caved immediately and gave a full confession to the detectives. Based on his statements and the physical evidence, here is a reconstruction of what actually happened inside that mobile home on the morning of November 28, 2009. The young man was completely broke, and he was getting desperate for cash because he wanted to take his girlfriend Christmas shopping for gifts. He searched through the drawers in his apartment until his hand closed around a metal grip, pulling out a .22 caliber pistol. He did not plan to hurt anyone. He simply decided to drive to the mobile home and pawn the firearm to Big Mike, knowing Mike always kept large amounts of cash on hand. He sat in the kitchen with Mike, and after a brief conversation, he handed the pistol over for inspection. Big Mike looked the weapon over thoughtfully, but then he handed it back and made an incredibly low cash offer. The young man took the gun back, feeling a bit disappointed, but he nodded in agreement. Mike turned his back to walk toward the storage room to grab his financial ledger, but as he did, the young man's finger accidentally brushed against the trigger. The hammer was still cocked from Mike's inspection, and the gun suddenly went off. A single bullet struck Big Mike in the back of the neck, and his massive frame collapsed heavily onto the kitchen floor. Val heard the loud noise from the living room and rushed into the kitchen, letting out a scream when she saw her husband motionless on the ground. The young man completely panicked, and to stop her from screaming, he raised the pistol and shot her in the temple. He then ran to the back storage room, grabbed the heavy metal safe, and pulled the specific ledger book that contained his own name out of the stack so the police would not see his debt. He walked past the bodies on the floor, went outside, and carefully locked the trailer door behind him, hoping the delay would buy him enough time to get out of town before anyone discovered the crime scene. Now, to throw the investigators off his tail, Nate had intentionally fabricated the entire story about the mystery woman with the glasses and bangs arriving at the door. But as he sat with the department sketch artist, dictating the specific facial features, his intense guilt caused him to subconsciously describe his own face. When detectives looked at the composite poster weeks later, they realized the narrow face, thin nose, and distinct glasses in the sketch matched Nate Nightingale perfectly. Nate Nightingale was put on trial and subsequently sentenced to 40 years in prison for the murder of Val and 15 years for the manslaughter of Big Mike, with the sentences running concurrently. Mike Jr. and Matt sat completely stone-faced in the pews as their former friend was led away in heavy metal handcuffs. And ever since that winter, the two brothers always celebrate Matt's daughter's birthday a week early, so that on November 28th, they can simply remember their parents. On a warm afternoon in June of 1964, teenagers pulled their motorcycles off a quiet paved road and down a narrow dirt trail leading toward the shores of Lake Bodom, a large, deep body of water located just a few miles northwest of Helsinki, Finland. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting off the glassy surface of the water, and the air was filled with the heavy scent of pine needles and fresh birch leaves. The group consisted of two 18-year-old best friends, Seppo Boisman and Nils Gustafsson, along with their 15-year-old girlfriends, Anja Maki and Mela Björklund. They had been planning this weekend camping trip for months, saving up their pocket money to buy fuel for the bikes and pack supplies for a night out in the wilderness, completely away from the crowded streets of the city. And you know, they were just regular teenagers who were kind of excited to finally have some freedom for the weekend. Seppo was incredibly proud of his motorcycle, a shiny machine that he spent hours polishing and tuning in his driveway, and Nils was just as passionate about riding. The girls had spent the previous evening packing their canvas bags with bathing suits, towels, and a collection of sandwiches wrapped carefully in heavy brown paper. Nils had also managed to get his hands on a small glass bottle of cheap liquor, which he had hidden securely inside his leather saddlebag, planning to surprise the others once they set up their camp for the night. As they rode down the trail, the girls wrapped their arms tightly around the boys' waists, laughing as the engines roared through the trees. So they eventually found the perfect spot to set up their camp on a small isolated peninsula that jutted out directly into the deep blue water of the lake. This specific location meant they had the water surrounding them on three sides, while a thick, dense wall of pine trees stood directly behind them, cutting them off from the rest of the world. Kids cut across the neighboring fields without a care, and local fishermen were scattered far down the shoreline, casting their lines into the water from small wooden rowboats. The teenagers unpacked their gear and unrolled a heavy canvas ridge tent, hammering the wooden pegs deep into the soft, damp soil right near the edge of the water, completely focused on making sure everything was secure before the sun began to drop below the horizon. Now, once the tent was completely set up, they all changed into their bathing suits and dove straight into the cool lake. The water was still freezing since it was only the very beginning of the summer season, but they did not care, splashing each other and laughing until their skin turned pale from the cold. They crawled back onto the grassy shore, dried off with their thick towels, and sat in a circle to eat their sandwiches. Seppo and Nils pulled out the hidden bottle of liquor, passing it back and forth between them, taking slow sips and talking about their plans for the upcoming school year and the motorcycles they hoped to build. The atmosphere was completely relaxed, with the golden afternoon light slowly fading into a long, drawn-out northern twilight that kept the sky dimly lit for hours. But as the night grew older, the temperature dropped significantly, and a damp chill began to roll off the surface of the lake, fogging up the heavy air. The teenagers gathered up their trash, stepped out of their heavy leather boots, and left them sitting right outside the tent flaps before crawling inside to get out of the cold. The ridge tent was quite small, really designed to hold 2 adults at most, so with 4 teenagers inside, it was a total squeeze. They had to lie completely flat on their backs, packed tightly together shoulder to shoulder, with the heavy canvas fabric hanging just a few inches above their faces. But they were exhausted from the long ride and the swimming, and within minutes, the chatter died down, the heavy silence of the forest took over, and all 4 of them fell fast asleep. Sometime between 4 and 6 in the morning, while the sky was still a pale gray and a thick blanket of white mist was hovering over the water, a sudden brutal nightmare unfolded on that lonely peninsula. Without any warning, a dark figure stepped out from the dense wall of pine trees and approached the silent tent. The individual did not try to unzip the front flaps or call out to the sleeping teenagers inside. Instead, they stood on the outside of the structure and launched a savage, frenzied assault directly through the heavy canvas. The assailant swung a heavy, blunt object down with massive force, smashing it through the fabric and striking the sleeping youths in their heads, completely crushing the wooden support poles and causing the entire tent to collapse inward on top of them. And then the attacker pulled out a sharp blade and began frantically stabbing downward into the tangled, heavy mound of canvas. The teenagers were completely trapped like fish inside a net, unable to move, see their attacker, or even fight back as the sharp steel ripped through the fabric and sliced deep into their skin. Mela Björklund took the absolute brunt of the violence, her body being struck and stabbed dozens of times through the ruined canvas, while her friends groaned and struggled beneath her in the dark. The attack was quick, clinical, and completely devastating, lasting only a few minutes before the heavy thudding sound stopped, leaving only the sound of labored breathing and blood dripping onto the grass and damp soil below. Around 6 o'clock that morning, 2 young boys were walking along a dirt path on the opposite side of the lake, carrying small binoculars to look for birds in the early morning light. As they scanned the tree line across the water, they noticed the 2 motorcycles parked on the peninsula. But they saw that the tent had completely flattened against the ground. And right as they were watching, they spotted a lone man with light blonde hair walking quietly away from the ruined campsite, stepping into the thick brush and disappearing into the dense forest. The boys just assumed, that the campers had decided to pack up their site early, so they did not think much of it and simply continued down the path completely unaware of the grim scene across the water. But by 11 o'clock that morning, a local carpenter named Risto Siren was taking his dog for a walk along the edge of the peninsula. As they approached the tree line near the water, the dog suddenly stiffened its ears, pinning back against its skull as it let out a low, turgid growl. The animal pulled violently on the leather leash, dragging Risto through the thick bushes until they stepped out into the clearing. Risto stopped dead in his tracks, his breath completely catching in his throat. The canvas tent was a total wreck, shredded into long ribbons and completely drenched in large dark red stains that were soaking into the grass. And lying directly on top of the collapsed bloody fabric was the body of Nils Gustafsson, his face severely swollen, his jaw visibly shattered, and blood pouring from deep gashes on his head. Risto dropped the leash, turned around, and sprinted as fast as he could to the nearest farmhouse to use their landline phone to alert the authorities. Within an hour, local police officers and medical personnel swarmed the peninsula, blocking off the trail with heavy rope. The EMTs rushed to Nils, confirming that against all odds he was actually still breathing, though his pulse was incredibly weak and he was entirely unconscious. They lifted his limp body onto a stretcher and rushed him to the surgical hospital in Helsinki. The detectives then turned their attention to the ruined tent. Carefully gripping the slashed edges of the canvas and lifting the heavy fabric up to see what was underneath. Inside the flattened tent lay the bodies of Seppo, Anja, and Mila. The scene was completely static, with the victims showing massive, devastating blunt force trauma to their skulls and dozens of deep puncture wounds across their torsos. The medical examiner noted right away that none of the victims inside had any defensive wounds on their hands, meaning they had been completely caught off guard while they were sleeping, completely unable to shield themselves from the matacon. Blows. But as the crime scene technicians began photographing the lot, they noticed something highly unusual. Even though the valuable motorcycles were left untouched and Nils's wallet was still inside the pocket of his trousers, several bizarrely specific items were completely missing from the campsite. The keys to both motorcycles were completely gone. Seppo's leather jacket had vanished, and the heavy leather shoes belonging to Nils were nowhere to be found. The investigators brought in a team of specialized tracking dogs, letting them sniff around the flattened canvas before releasing them into the thick wall of pine trees behind the site. The dogs ran fast through the brush, tracking a distinct scent for about half a mile, until they stopped at the edge of a deep gravel ditch running along a dirt road. Hidden carefully inside the ditch, covered with loose leaves and dirt, the police found Nils's missing shoes. The leather was heavily spattered with blood, and wrapped inside were a few pieces of clothing belonging to Seppo, but the murder weapons themselves were completely missing. So the detectives rushed to the hospital in Helsinki, waiting by Nils's bedside for days, until the swelling in his brain went down and he finally opened his eye. But when they began questioning him about the night of the attack, Nils could give them almost nothing. He was completely disoriented from the severe concussion, his jaw wired shut with metal braces, and his memory was totally fragmented. He claimed that he remembered sleeping, and then a sudden explosive pain in his face, and for just a single split second, he remembered the image of a pair of eyes staring down at him through a long tear in the canvas fabric. He said the eyes looked completely cold, almost like they were glowing in the dark before everything just went completely black. With no clear clues from the lone survivor, the police began a massive dragnet of the surrounding area, interviewing thousands of people and running down every single local rumor. Their first major suspect was a man named Valdemar Gillstrom, who ran the small local kiosk down the road from the lake. Valdemar was notorious among the locals for having an absolute raging hatred for the tourists and teenagers who came to camp on the peninsula. He would frequently stand on the dirt path, his face turning completely red as he screamed profanities at the campers. And he had been caught multiple times throwing heavy rocks at tents or sneaking out in the middle of the night to cut the guy ropes so the canvas would collapse on the people sleeping inside. Years after the murders, Valdemar actually broke his silence, drunkenly confessing to a close neighbor that he was the one who had slaughtered the teenagers at Lake Bodom because they were trespassing on his territory. But the very next morning, before the detectives could officially bring him into the station for formal questioning, Valdemar walked straight out into the deep waters of Lake Bodom and drowned himself. The police thoroughly investigated his background, but his wife signed a sworn statement insisting that her husband had been in bed sleeping right beside her the entire night of the attack. With no physical evidence linking him to the campsite, the detectives had to drop the lead, leaving Valdemar a dead suspect in a dead-end investigation. Now, their second primary lead was an enigmatic man named Hans Osman. On June 6th, less than 24 hours after the bodies were discovered on the peninsula, Hans walked into the surgical hospital in Helsinki, and his behavior immediately set off massive red flags for the medical staff. He was acting completely erratic, speaking incoherently, and occasionally pretending to fall completely unconscious on the waiting room floor. The nurses noticed that his fingernails were packed with thick black dirt, and his trousers and shirt sleeves were stained with distinct, dark red spots that looked exactly like dried blood. Hans also had light blonde hair, perfectly matching the description of the strange man the birdwatching boys had seen walking away from the flattened tent. The doctors were so unsettled by his presence that they locked Hans in an exam room and contacted the police department immediately. But when the detectives arrived to interview him, the interaction was incredibly brief. Hans provided a vague alibi involving some associates at a local estate. And for reasons that have never been fully explained, the investigators simply accepted his story at face value. They allowed him to walk right out of the hospital doors without even bagging his stained clothing or taking a blood sample for analysis. Rumors quickly spread through Helsinki that Hans was actually a covert KGB operative, protected by high-ranking political officials. And the police completely crossed his name off the suspect list, causing the entire case to freeze over. For decades. Years turned into decades, and the file boxes for the Lake Bodom murders sat on the bottom metal shelves of the National Archives, slowly gathering dust, while the public debated the mystery online. But in April of 2004, 44 years after the slaughter, the Finnish National Bureau of Investigation made an announcement that completely paralyzed the nation. They had officially reopened the cold case file and placed a grandfather in his early 60s under arrest for the triple homicide. The man they led away in handcuffs was Nils Gustafsson, the only person who had survived that grim morning on the peninsula. Modern forensic science had finally caught up to the case, and scientists had run advanced DNA profiling and bloodstain pattern analysis on the heavy leather shoes that had been found hidden in the woods half a mile away. The new laboratory reports revealed that the outside of Nils's shoes was completely drenched in the blood of Mila, Anya, and Seppo, with the blood spatter pattern proving that the shoes had to be right next to the victims when their wounds were inflicted. But there was absolutely no blood belonging to Nils on the exterior of the leather. The prosecution argued that this was the definitive key to the entire mystery, claiming that whoever committed the slaughter had to be wearing those shoes during the attack to create that specific spatter pattern. Since Nils's own blood was completely missing from the outside of the shoes, it meant he could not have been lying inside the tent getting beaten while the shoes were exposed to the spray, completely contradicting his original statement. To the detectives. In August of 2005, Nils Gustafsson stood before the Espoo District Court, facing 3 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution laid out a massive, detailed narrative for the jury, attempting to dismantle 45 years of mystery with a clinical theory of a teenage dispute gone completely wrong. Based on the new DNA profiling, the bloodstain patterns on the leather, and the original police logs from 1960, here is the reconstruction of what the authorities believe actually happened on that lonely peninsula near the water. Sometime around 4 o'clock in the morning, after hours of drinking the cheap liquor from the saddlebag, an intense, volatile argument broke out between Seppo and Nils inside the incredibly cramped tent. The girls tried to quiet them down, but the boys' tempers were completely flared up, and the dispute quickly turned physical. Seppo, being a bit larger and stronger, lunged forward and delivered a series of powerful punches to Nils's face, completely shattering his jaw and fracturing his cheekbones before dragging him to the tent opening and physically kicking him out into the grass. Nils stood outside in the damp morning mist, his mouth pooling with blood, feeling a massive wave of humiliation and blinding rage as he looked at the canvas structure where his best friend and his girlfriend were sleeping. He walked slowly down to the shoreline, his boots crunching quietly on the gravel, and his eyes locked onto a large, heavy rock resting in the dirt. He picked up the stone, pulled his folding knife from his pocket, and walked back up the grassy slope toward the ridge tent. He did not bother to open the front flaps or look inside. He stood over the canvas and began blindly, savagely swinging the heavy rock downward with all his might, smashing it into the skulls of his sleeping friends right through the heavy fabric. He lashed out with the blade, slicing long ribbons through the canvas walls, stabbing into the thrashing mounds of fabric until the muffled screams completely died down, and the peninsula went entirely silent. When the realization of what he had done finally hit him, he knew he had to completely clear his trail if he wanted to escape a life sentence. He slipped off his blood-spattered leather shoes and walked half a mile into the dark forest, hiding them inside the deep ditch along with Seppo's jacket to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. He then threw the heavy rock and the knife far out into the deep water of lake bottom, completely erasing the murder weapons from existence. Nils then walked back to the campsite, climbed directly on top of the collapsed bloody tent, and lay flat on his back beside the victims, waiting for hours until the morning sun rose and the first local residents arrived to discover the scene, playing the role of the tragic survivor for the next 44 years. But the prosecution's elaborate theory completely collapsed the moment the defense team brought their own medical experts to the stand. These prominent neurologists and orthopedic surgeons had manually re-examined the original 1960 hospital records, and they presented a set of physical facts that the jury simply could not ignore. They proved that the fractures to Nils's jaw and facial bones were so severe and the resulting brain concussion was so debilitating that he would have experienced immediate, total motor collapse the exact second he was struck. A human being with injuries that catastrophic would be completely physically incapacitated, unable to stand up, let alone walk half a mile through a dense trackless forest to hide a pair of shoes and stage a complex crime scene. In October of 2005, after reviewing the medical testimony, the court completely acquitted Nils Gustafsson of all charges, declaring him an innocent man and ordering the Finnish government to pay him a massive financial settlement for his time spent in custody. Nils walked out of the courtroom, a free man returning to his quiet retirement, while the case of the Lake Bodom murders slid right back into the dark corners of unsolved history. The true identity of the blonde man seen walking into the pine trees remains a total cipher, leaving behind only an empty peninsula where the wind moves through the birch leaves and the deep, silent water continues to guard its oldest secrets in absolute silence. When you look back at the tragedy that occurred on the shores of Lake Bodom in 1960, you are not just looking at a cold case file full of old police reports. You are looking at the exact moment a whole nation lost its sense of safety. 4 regular teenagers went out to enjoy a beautiful summer night, and within hours, 3 of them were completely gone. It shows us how incredibly fragile our everyday calm really is, you know. The most disturbing part of this entire story is not the physical violence itself, but rather the absolute normalcy that preceded it. These kids were doing what millions of teenagers do every single weekend around the world. They were laughing, sharing sandwiches, and talking about their futures by the water. There was no warning sign and no reason to expect danger. And that is exactly what makes this case hang over our heads, like a heavy shadow. It forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable truth about the world we live in. We like to believe that tragedy only happens to people who take massive risks. But these 4 youths did everything right, choosing a scenic spot in a community where everyone felt secure. Yet, a monster still managed to find them in the dark, proving that the line between a normal life and a total disaster is as thin as a single sheet of canvas fabric. Now, from a social perspective, an unsolved crime like this does not just hurt the families. It completely fractures the collective psyche of the entire community you know. When a killer vanishes so thoroughly into the night, the surrounding town is left with a permanent wound. Neighbors begin looking at each other with quiet suspicion, wondering if the person they pass on the sidewalk is the one who holds the deadly secret. This deep social trauma shows how an unsolved crime can warp the geography of a town over time. Lake Bodom ceased to be just a body of water where families went to swim and fish on weekends. Instead, it became an active question mark, a physical space carrying a heavy burden of collective grief. The landscape was kind of tainted by the memory of a ghost, proving that a single night of violence can redefine an entire region for decades. And that paranoia can pass down through generations, transforming a beautiful local landmark into a place of quiet dread. For decades after 1960, parents in Finland would warn their children about going near the shores of Lake Bodom after dark. The landscape itself became a monument to an unresolved mystery, a place where people were reminded that evil could strike without a motive and leave absolutely no trace behind. But this case also highlights a massive systemic issue regarding the historical limitations of criminal investigations. Back in 1960, law enforcement did not have access to the advanced tools we take for granted today. There was no automated fingerprint matching, no satellite tracking, and certainly no DNA analysis to pin a suspect to a crime scene. Investigators had to rely almost entirely on physical search grids and erratic accounts. So when a crime scene was as chaotic and complicated as the collapsed tent on the peninsula, those early methods were pushed past their limits. The local police were completely overwhelmed by the sheer scale of public pressure, which can sometimes force an investigation to move too quickly. When a system is desperate to provide answers to a terrified public, it becomes dangerously easy to overlook subtle details or clear alternative leads. We see this clearly when we examine how the authorities manage the initial pool of suspects. For years, the community tried to map their own fears onto outcasts and eccentric neighbors like the local kiosk owner, who openly despised campers. It is a natural human reaction to want the monster to have a face we already dislike. But suspicion alone cannot substitute for hard facts, and a system built on rumors will always run into a dead end. The same systemic frustration applies to the fascinating case of Hans Assmann, the alleged spy who walked into the hospital with stained clothes. The fact that the detectives let him leave without testing his garments shows how easily crucial evidence can slip through the cracks of a botched operation. It leaves us with a lingering bitter question about whether justice was sacrificed due to bureaucratic oversight or political interference. Furthermore, it forces us to look at how systems of authority handle their own mistakes when the public spotlight is blindingly intense. When a police force fails to secure a crime scene or test fluid blocks from a primary suspect, the integrity of the entire legal structure is called into question. The failure to find a definitive answer creates a legacy of deep cynicism where regular citizens lose faith in the system. And that is what makes the systemic perspective so tragic in the long run. When an investigation fails in those critical first 48 hours, the truth begins to dissolve as time washes away the physical tracks. The memories of witnesses fade, the original evidence degrades on the shelves, and the possibility of finding true closure becomes more remote with every passing year, leaving a community suspended in a state of permanent doubt. Then, of course, we have to look at the massive twist that occurred 44 years later with the arrest of Nils Gustafsson. This completely redefined the case from a standard whodunit into a complex legal and ethical dilemma. It showed the immense power of modern forensic technology, like DNA profiling, to breathe new life into ancient files. But it also exposed the profound danger of trying to force an old mystery into a modern mold. The system spent over 4 decades treating Nils as a tragic victim, only to suddenly pivot and paint him as a calculated mass murderer. For the public, this was an incredibly jarring narrative shift that forced everyone to look at the sole survivor with brand new eyes. It made people wonder if the person they had pitied for nearly half a century was actually the monster who had brought total devastation to his closest friends. This dramatic shift highlights the profound societal impact of institutional desperation. When a historic mystery remains unsolved for generations, it creates a massive vacuum that the system is constantly tempted to fill. The danger arises when the desire to close a file outweighs the fundamental duty to uncover absolute truth, reminding us that a rush to judgment can create a whole new layer of tragedy within an already broken landscape. This historic trial also exposed the immense psychological pressure placed on a person who has to live as a living clue for their entire existence. Nils Gustafsson didn't just survive a physical assault. He spent his whole life carrying the burden of being the only person who witnessed the monster. To have the system suddenly turn around and accuse you of destroying your own friends must be a level of isolation that is deeply overwhelming. But when the trial concluded with a full acquittal, it demonstrated the beautiful resilience of the justice system when it functions properly. The court refused to allow emotional pressure or forensic speculation to substitute for absolute proof, recognizing that a broken jaw and severe trauma cannot be easily ignored. It served as a powerful reminder that our legal systems must remain calm and objective, even when dealing with the most historic crimes. Now, when we move past the courts and the suspects, the true essence of this case lies in the lessons it leaves behind about compassion. We must remember that Mila, Anya, and Seppo were real individuals with parents who loved them and futures that were completely stolen away. Their families had to live the rest of their lives without ever knowing who destroyed their households, carrying a weight of grief that is truly unimaginable. As time moves forward, the people who personally remembered the victims gradually pass away, and the direct connection to the tragedy begins to fade into abstract history. This makes the systemic duty of archiving and remembering even more critical for society, you know. We have to ensure that the passage of 40 or 50 years does not erase the reality of their existence, keeping their names alive so they do not simply become a ghost story told in the dark. And our responsibility as a society is to make sure that these victims are never reduced to mere characters in a true crime story or trivia questions on the internet. We owe it to their memory to discuss their lives with a deep sense of respect and dignity, focusing on the absolute tragedy of their lost potential rather than just the lurid details of their deaths. True compassion means holding space for their memory, even when the answers are gone. This case also teaches us a vital lesson about community responsibility and the need for constant vigilance. Protecting one another is not just a job for the police department or the local government. It is a shared duty that belongs to every single neighbor on the street. We have to look out for the vulnerable, pay attention to the small changes in our environments, and cultivate a culture where people feel completely supported. Vigilance does not mean living in a state of constant paralyzing fear or looking at every stranger with absolute hostility. It simply means understanding that the safety we enjoy is something that must be actively maintained through care and connection. When we build strong, cohesive communities where people actually know and support each other, we create a natural shield that makes it much harder for darkness to take root undetected. When we step back and look at the broader social network, we realize that a community's safety is directly tied to its capacity for empathy and active engagement. It requires us to move past the superficial layers of neighborhood politeness and cultivate genuine bonds where people feel truly seen and protected, you know. By building these deep, resilient networks of mutual support, we create a powerful deterrent against the random shadows that threaten our everyday security. Because at the end of the day, the fine line between a perfectly normal life and a total tragedy is something that affects every single one of us. You can be sitting at your kitchen table planning a fun weekend, completely convinced that your future is secure, and within 24 hours, everything can change completely. The teenagers at Lake Bodom were not looking for trouble. They were just kind of living their best lives in the sunshine. Our fascination with these cold cases is kind of driven by a deep human desire to restore order to a universe that often feels completely chaotic and unfair. We want to believe that every puzzle has a solution and that every act of malice will eventually face an official reckoning in a court of law. But Lake Bodom stands as a stark reminder that some secrets are never surrendered, leaving us to navigate the world without the neat conclusions we crave. It forces us to accept that some narratives in this life do not come with a satisfying resolution neatly tied up at the end. We are forced to coexist with the ambiguity, carrying the memory of the lost, while navigating a world that remains completely indifferent to our demands for total clarity. The true measure of our resilience is how we maintain our compassion and our values, even when the answers we seek are buried under decades of absolute silence. It forces us to realize that the safety we enjoy is not an absolute law of nature, but rather a fragile agreement that we must continuously choose to uphold. The teenagers on that peninsula were surrounded by trees, water, and shifting clouds, completely at peace with their surroundings right before the dark intrusion. It shows us that danger does not always wear a clear warning sign, and it can hide right outside the familiar borders of our everyday lives. And that realization is exactly what makes true crime stories so deeply compelling and frightening to listen to from the safety of our homes. They hold up a mirror to our own vulnerabilities, reminding us that we are all walking along a very narrow ledge above a deep abyss. It makes us appreciate the quiet routine moments of our everyday lives so much more, knowing how quickly those familiar routines can be shattered by a random act of malice. So as we close the file on the Lake Bodom murders, we are left with a profound sense of mystery, but also a clear call to action. We cannot solve the riddle of who walked out of those woods in 1960, and we may never know the name of the light blonde man who vanished into the dense pine forest. Those secrets are likely buried forever in the deep soil of the peninsula, or lost at the bottom of the lake itself, you know. But we can choose how we live our lives in the shadow of that unresolved history. We can choose to practice greater compassion toward the people around us, to hold our loved ones a little bit closer, and to treat every regular day as a precious gift that should never be taken for granted. By bringing more care, vigilance, and understanding into our own neighborhoods, we honor the memory of those who were never able to come home.